Modern self-help tells you to visualize success. The Stoics said, visualize failure. Modern self-help tells you to control your destiny. The Stoics said, control almost nothing. Modern self-help tells you comfort is the goal. The Stoics said, comfort is the trap. The most powerful self-help system ever created is 2,000 years old. It was forged in slavery, in shipwrecks, in plague, in exile, in battlefields, and in the courts of the most dangerous emperors who ever lived. And the people who created it didn't write best-selling books or launch podcasts. They lived it. They bled for it. Some of them died for it. Tonight, we go back to the source. 18 Stoic practices, 18 real lives, 18 stories that modern self-help doesn't want you to hear because they're too raw, too honest, and too real for a world that prefers comfortable lives. This wisdom is not the Instagram quotes stripped of their context. It's the real practices, and each practice comes with a story. And each story, well, each story is the kind that stays with you, the kind that rewires something deep inside, the kind that makes you look at your own struggles and think, maybe I've been approaching this all wrong. Welcome, Nightlings. This is Huxley. Now, you know I love sharing wisdom with you here, but I have to tell you about something new, because some stories are too vivid, too wild to be shared here. Imagine drifting off tonight, but you're standing on the deck of Blackbeard's ship, salt air on your face. Tomorrow night, you're marching with your army as Alexander the Great. Next week, you're the sole survivor of a plane crash in the Amazon jungle. My team and I have created a new channel to tell these tales, the Sleepy Biographer. Same voice, same storytelling you fall asleep to. But instead of learning about these lives, you live them. Link for the Sleepy Biographer is in the description. Tell me if you like it. This is possible because of all of you. Thank you for your support, your comments, and coming back each night. Now, before we step into the world of Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and Seneca, let's prepare. Stanford researchers recently found that just 5 minutes of slow, extended exhale breathing, a technique called cyclic sighing, actually outperformed mindfulness meditation at reducing anxiety and improving mood. The longer exhale directly stimulates your vagus nerve, switching your nervous system from fight or flight into rest. So let's try it together. I call this the Stoic's breath. Inhale gently through your nose, filling your lungs slowly over 5 seconds. Hold that breath for just a moment. Feel the stillness. And now exhale slowly through your mouth for 8 seconds. Let everything go with that breath. Every worry, every unfinished thought. Again, inhale through your nose. 5 seconds of gentle filling. Hold. Just a moment of perfect stillness. And exhale. 8 long seconds. Letting the weight of the day leave your body like smoke leaving a chimney. I invite you to pause the episode and continue for a full 5 minutes if you like. Now, let's drift 2,000 years back. Around the year 300 BC, a wealthy merchant from the island of Cyprus was sailing through the Mediterranean. His name was Zeno. He was Phoenician, a man of the sea, a trader of purple dye, one of the most valuable commodities in the ancient world. His ship was loaded with goods. His future was secure. He had wealth. He had purpose. He had everything a man of his era could want. And then the sea took it all. Somewhere near Cape Malea, the treacherous southern tip of Greece, where the winds are unpredictable and the currents lethal, Zeno's ship went down. The cargo was lost. The wealth was gone. Everything he had worked for, everything he had planned, everything he had built, swallowed by the sea in a single, merciless afternoon. Zeno washed up in Athens, penniless, stranded, a foreigner in one of the greatest cities in the world, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a profound, bone-deep sense of loss. Now, here is where most stories would take a predictable turn. The man rebuilds, he works hard, he earns back his fortune. That's the self-help version. That's the motivational poster. Fall down 7 times, get up 8. But that's not what happened to Zeno. What happened to Zeno is far stranger, far more interesting, and far more powerful. Zeno wandered into a bookshop. He didn't have money to buy anything. He was probably just seeking shelter or killing time while he figured out what to do with his suddenly empty life. But the bookseller was reading aloud from a work by Xenophon, a student of Socrates, called the Memorabilia. And in that book, Zeno heard about Socrates, about a man who owned almost nothing, who was considered the wisest man in Athens, who asked questions that turned people's worlds upside down. Zeno looked up at the bookseller and asked a question that would change the course of Western civilization. "Where can I find men like that?" The bookseller pointed to a man walking past the shop, a philosopher named Crates, one of the cynics, the barefoot, shameless, society-rejecting radicals who believed virtue was the only good. Zeno followed him. And in that moment, in the simple act of a ruined merchant following a ragged philosopher through the streets of Athens, Stoicism was conceived. Not born yet, conceived. Because Zeno didn't just study under Crates, he studied under the Megarians, the academics, the dialecticians. He synthesized everything. He took the cynic emphasis on virtue, the Megarian focus on logic, the academic tradition of rigorous argument, and he created something entirely new. He began teaching at a public colonnade in Athens, known as the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch. Anyone could listen, rich or poor, citizen or foreigner, man or woman. The philosophy born in that open-air colonnade would become known by the place where it was taught, Stoicism, from the Stoa. Years later, someone asked Zeno about the shipwreck, about the day he lost everything, and his reply is one of the most extraordinary sentences in the history of philosophy. "I made a prosperous voyage when I was shipwrecked." Let that settle. Not, "I survived the shipwreck and eventually recovered." Not, "It was tough but I pushed through." Not, "God works in mysterious ways." He said the shipwreck itself was prosperous. The disaster itself was the gift. This is Amor Fati, love of fate. And it is perhaps the most radical practice in all of Stoicism. See, modern self-help handles adversity like this. Bad things happen, but stay positive. Look for the silver lining. Keep your chin up. It treats adversity as something to endure, something to get through, something to survive. The Stoics went further, way further. They said, don't just accept what happens. Love it. Not in a passive, defeated way. In a fierce, active, transformative way. Take the worst thing that ever happened to you and make it the best thing that ever happened to you. Not because it was pleasant, because of what you made from it. Zeno didn't recover from his shipwreck. He didn't bounce back. He used his shipwreck as the raw material for an entirely new vision of how to live. His loss didn't just make him stronger, it made him the founder of a philosophy that would guide emperors, console prisoners, strengthen soldiers, and provide comfort to millions of human beings for the next 2,300 years. And counting. There's a beautiful detail here that I don't want you to miss. When Zeno went into that bookshop, he wasn't looking for philosophy. He wasn't on a spiritual quest. He was a broken merchant, wandering without purpose. And he stumbled into a conversation about Socrates purely by accident. Or was it? Well, the Stoics would say, it doesn't matter. Whether it was fate, chance, luck, or the will of the gods, it happened. And the practice isn't about why things happen. It's about what you do with what happens. The question isn't why did this happen to me? The question is, what can I build from this? Zeno taught at the Painted Porch for decades. He attracted students from across the Greek world. His school survived him. His students Cleanthes and Chrysippus built on his ideas. His philosophy travelled to Rome, where it influenced Cicero, Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. It shaped the legal systems of civilizations. It influenced Christianity. It formed the basis of cognitive behavioral therapy. It is arguably the single most influential school of practical philosophy in Western history. All because a merchant lost his cargo in a storm. So, here's the practice. Not as a motivational slogan, but as something real. Something you can use tonight, tomorrow morning, and for the rest of your life. When something goes wrong, and it will go wrong, because that's what life does, don't ask why me. Ask, what can I make from this? Don't just endure. Don't just survive. Love your fate, not because it's easy, not because it's fair, but because somewhere in the wreckage there is material for something you haven't built yet. Something you couldn't have imagined before the storm. Zeno of Citium died around 262 BC. One account says he tripped leaving his school, broke his toe and declared, I come, why do you call for me? Then held his breath and died. Whether that's true or embellished, it fits. A man so committed to accepting fate that he greeted death the way he greeted his shipwreck, with open arms. Practice 2. The Dichotomy of Control. Somewhere around the year 50 AD in the small town of Hierapolis, in what is now modern Turkey, a child was born into slavery. He didn't choose his name. His name was Epictetus, which isn't even a name. It's a Greek word. It means acquired. That's what they called him. The acquired one, the purchased one, the property. He was owned by a man named Epaphroditus. Now, Epaphroditus was not an ordinary slaveholder. He was the personal secretary to Emperor Nero, one of the most powerful freedmen in Rome, a man who lived at the very center of imperial power, in the golden, blood-soaked court of one of history's most unstable rulers. Young Epictetus grew up in this world, surrounded by luxury but owning nothing, watching the richest and most powerful men in the world scheme, panic, betray and destroy each other, all while he, a slave, could do nothing about any of it. And it was in this crucible, this position of absolute powerlessness, that Epictetus began to understand something that would become the single most important idea in Stoic philosophy. There is a story about Epictetus and his master that has survived 2,000 years. The details vary depending on the source. Some say Epaphroditus twisted Epictetus's leg. Some say he allowed it to be broken as a punishment. The ancient historian Origen provides one version. And in that version, while Epaphroditus was twisting his leg, while the bone was cracking, while the pain must have been beyond description, Epictetus looked up at his master calmly. "You are going to break it," he said. His master kept twisting. The leg snapped, and Epictetus, with the same calm, said, "Did I not tell you it would break?" No screaming, no begging, no anger, just observation. As if he were watching it happen to someone else. As if the leg, his own leg, belonged to the category of things that were not his to control. Now, I want to be honest with you. Some scholars question the exact details of this story. The sources disagree on exactly how Epictetus became lame. But the story has survived for 2,000 years because, whether literally true in every detail or not, it captures something essential about who this man was, and what he taught. Because here is what Epictetus went on to do with his life. After Nero's suicide in 68 AD, Epaphroditus lost his power. Eventually, Epictetus gained his freedom. We don't know exactly when or how, but we know that a former slave, walking with a permanent limp from a leg broken by his own master, made his way into the world as a free man. And he began to teach, not right away. First, he studied, under Musonius Rufus, the Roman Socrates, who was himself teaching from exile. Epictetus absorbed everything. And then, around 93 AD, when Emperor Domitian expelled all philosophers from Rome, Epictetus did not complain. He did not protest. He did what a Stoic does. He adapted. He moved to Nicopolis, in northwestern Greece. And there, he opened a school that would attract students from across the Roman world, rich men's sons, future senators, military officers, people who had everything that Epictetus never had: wealth, status, freedom from birth, and yet they travelled hundreds of miles to sit at the feet of a crippled former slave. Because Epictetus had something none of them had. He had the truth. And the truth was terrifyingly simple. He would stand before his students, or more accurately, sit because of his leg, and he would say the words that would echo through every century since, "Some things are within our power, while others are not. Within our power are opinion, motivation, desire, aversion, and in a word, whatever is of our own doing. Not within our power are our body, our property, reputation, office, and in a word, whatever is not of our own doing." This is the dichotomy of control, and it is the bedrock, the foundation stone. Every other Stoic practice, the inner citadel, Amor Fati, Memento Mori, all of them, flows from this single distinction. Your thoughts, yours. Your judgments, yours. Your choices about how to respond to what happens, yours. Your body, not fully yours. It can be broken, as Epictetus knew. Your reputation, not yours. It lives in other people's minds. Your possessions, not yours. They can be taken in an instant. Other people's opinions, actions, feelings, definitely not yours. Never were. Now, this sounds simple. Almost too simple. And you might be thinking, well, sure, that's obvious, but here's why it's not obvious. Here's why it's revolutionary. Because almost everything that causes you pain is something outside your control that you're treating as if it's inside your control. Your boss's opinion of you, your child's choices, the economy, traffic, the weather, whether that person texts you back, whether your body cooperates, whether life is fair. You suffer because you're trying to control things that were never yours to control. And the energy you spend on that futile effort, that's energy you're not spending on the things you can control. Your responses, your character, your effort, your attitude, your kindness. Epictetus didn't teach this as an abstract philosophy. He taught it as a man who had lived it. A man who was born with nothing. A man whose body was broken by someone else's cruelty. A man who was expelled from his home by an emperor's decree. And through all of it, through slavery, through injury, through exile, he maintained something his master and his emperor and every powerful man who ever tried to control him never could touch. His mind, his judgments. In 1965, a Navy pilot named James Stockdale was shot down over North Vietnam as he parachuted into enemy territory, knowing he would be captured, knowing he would be tortured, knowing he might never see his family again. He whispered something to himself. I'm leaving the world of technology and entering the world of Epictetus. Stockdale spent 7.5 years as a prisoner of war. He was tortured over 12 times. He spent 4 years in solitary confinement. He walked with a permanent limp for the rest of his life, just like Epictetus. And throughout his captivity, the thing that kept him alive, the thing that kept him sane, was the dichotomy of control. He couldn't control whether he was beaten. He could control whether he betrayed his fellow prisoners. He couldn't control when he'd be released. He could control his integrity, his courage, his refusal to break. He couldn't control the pain. He could control his response to it. Stockdale later observed something haunting about the prisoners who didn't survive. He called it the Stockdale paradox. You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality. The optimists, Stockdale said, the ones who kept saying, we'll be home by Christmas, they were the ones who died. Not from torture, from heartbreak, because Christmas would come and they wouldn't be home, and then Easter, and then the next Christmas, and hope without the discipline to accept what you cannot control becomes the cruelest prison of all. That's the dichotomy of control in action, not as a philosophy class exercise, as survival. So, here's the practice. Tonight, as you lie here, ask yourself, what am I trying to control that isn't mine to control? What am I carrying that isn't mine to carry? And what would happen if I set it down? Not forever, just for tonight, just for right now. Let the things that aren't yours stop being your burden and really feel what it's like to hold only what's truly yours. Your thoughts, your responses, your choice about who to be tomorrow. A slave understood this. An emperor understood this. A prisoner of war understood this. And tonight, maybe you can too. Epictetus died around 135 AD in Nicopolis. He lived simply, some say in a house with only a bed, a mat, and a clay lamp. After his death, someone reportedly bought that clay lamp for 3,000 drachmas, a fortune, for the lamp of a man who owned almost nothing. Because they weren't buying a lamp. They were buying a piece of the most free man who ever lived. Practice 3. The Inner Citadel. In the spring of 121 AD, a boy was born in Rome to one of the city's most distinguished families. His name was Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. His father, a praetor, a judge, a man of considerable standing, died when Marcus was just 3 years old. The boy barely remembered him. But someone else noticed Marcus. The Emperor Hadrian himself, aging, brilliant, and obsessed with legacy, saw something in this quiet, serious child that he didn't see in anyone else. He gave Marcus a nickname, Verissimus. It means the most truthful one. And he wasn't wrong. By the age of 12, Marcus had fallen in love with philosophy. Not just reading it, living it. When his painting teacher, Diognetus, introduced him to the Stoic way of life, Marcus did something that stunned his entire household. He threw away his soft bedding. He put on a rough Greek cloak, the kind worn by wandering philosophers, not Roman aristocrats. And he began sleeping on the ground. He was 12 years old, sleeping on a stone floor, by choice. His mother had to convince him to at least use a bed covered with animal skins. The boy reluctantly agreed. But something had changed in Marcus that would never change back. He had discovered that comfort was not the same as strength, that softness was not the same as peace, that the only refuge worth building was the one inside your own mind. Now you might think this is just a nice childhood story, a precocious kid playing philosopher. But what happened next turned it into something far more serious. In the winter of 138 AD, the elderly Emperor Hadrian was dying, and he made a decision that would shape the course of history. He adopted a senator named Antoninus Pius, but there was a condition, a brilliant, calculated condition. Antoninus had to adopt Marcus Aurelius. It was a 2-generation succession plan. Hadrian was essentially saying, Antoninus, you'll be emperor next. But the boy Marcus, he'll be emperor after you. Marcus didn't want it. He never wanted it. When he learned of Hadrian's plan, his first reaction wasn't excitement or ambition, it was dread. He wrote later that he moved from his mother's house to Hadrian's private residence with the reluctance of a man entering a prison, not a palace. Think about that. The most powerful position in the known world, and the man destined for it saw it as a cage. 23 years passed. Antoninus Pius was a good emperor, a steady hand, and Marcus waited, studying, reading Epictetus's discourses obsessively, the writings of a former slave that became his intellectual and spiritual foundation, marrying Faustina, having children, watching most of those children die. At least 14 children born. The majority would not survive, some dying as infants, others as young children. Of his sons, only one would live, Commodus. A handful of daughters survived, but Marcus buried child after child after child. Let that settle for a moment. Most of his children lost. And then, in 161 AD, Antoninus Pius died, and Marcus Aurelius, the reluctant philosopher, became emperor. His first act? Something no emperor had ever done. He insisted on sharing power with his adopted brother Lucius Verus. For the first time in Roman history, 2 emperors ruled side by side. He didn't want all the power. He didn't even want half of it. But he accepted it, because that's what duty demanded. And then everything went wrong. The Antonine Plague arrived in 165 AD. Soldiers returning from campaigns in the east brought it back with them. It spread through the empire like fire through dry grass. The best estimates suggest it killed between 5 and 10 million people across the Roman world. At its peak, 2,000 people were dying every single day in Rome alone. Marcus didn't flee. While Roman aristocrats retreated to their country estates, the emperor stayed. He opened the imperial treasury. And then, when the treasury ran dry, he did something that shocked the Roman elite to their core. He held a public auction of the imperial possessions. Gold goblets, silk robes, paintings, his wife's jewelry, even furniture from the palace. The Emperor of Rome selling his own belongings to fund plague relief and border defense, rather than raise taxes on a population already devastated by disease. And then came the wars, the Marcomannic Wars. Germanic tribes, the Marcomanni, the Quadi, the Sarmatians, pressed against the northern frontier. Marcus, who had never held a sword in battle, who had never left Italy before the age of 49, marched north to the Danube. This is where the Meditations were written, not in a comfortable Roman villa, not in a philosophical salon, in military tents, on the edge of the known world, in modern-day Austria, Hungary, and Slovakia. Book 2 was written among the Quadi on the River Gran, deep in barbarian territory. Book 3 at Carnuntum, near modern Vienna. And what did he write? He wrote reminders, to himself, private notes that were never meant for anyone else's eyes. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. When you arise in the morning, think of what a privilege it is to be alive, to think, to enjoy, to love. But also this, the key to everything, the practice that held him together through plague, through war, through the deaths of his children, through the crushing weight of an office he never wanted. Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul. Avail yourself of this retreat and renew yourself. The inner citadel. That's what the philosopher Pierre Hadot would later call it. The idea that inside every human being there is a place that cannot be touched. Not by plague, not by war, not by grief, not by the cruelty of fate. A place where your thoughts are your own, where your judgments are your own, where your freedom, the only freedom that truly matters, is absolute. Marcus Aurelius didn't discover this practice in comfort. He discovered it in catastrophe. He retreated to his inner citadel not because life was easy, but because life was impossible. And in that retreat, he found something that 20 centuries of philosophers, psychologists, and seekers have been trying to describe ever since. The most powerful man in the world found power in powerlessness. The Emperor of Rome found freedom in surrender. The philosopher who slept on stone as a boy learned that the hardest ground you'll ever sleep on is the battlefield of your own mind. And here's the ironic part. The private journal he never intended anyone to read, those battlefield scribbles he wrote to keep himself sane, they became one of the most read, most translated, most cherished books in all of human history. We call them the Meditations. And every self-help book written since, every think positive mantra, every mindfulness exercise, every find your inner peace workshop. They're all, whether they know it or not, echoes of an exhausted philosopher-emperor, writing by candlelight in a tent on the Danube, trying to survive one more night. Marcus Aurelius died on campaign in March of 180 AD. His last recorded words were to an officer of his guard, who asked for the day's watchword. Marcus replied, "Go to the rising sun, I am already setting." He was 58 years old. He had led the empire through plague, through war, through personal tragedy that would have broken most men. And he left behind a son, Commodus, who would become one of the worst emperors in Roman history. A gladiator-obsessed tyrant who undid nearly everything his father had built. But here's the thing Marcus would have told you if you'd asked him about that. It wasn't in his control. His son's choices were not his to make. The empire's future was not his to guarantee. The only thing that was ever truly his was the citadel inside his own mind. And that citadel held. The practice is simple. When chaos comes, and it will come, you withdraw, not from the world, not from your responsibilities, but into yourself. You examine your judgments. You ask, is this within my control, or outside it? You find the quiet place within. And from that place of calm, you act. Marcus Aurelius found his citadel in the middle of plague and war. But the most powerful test of Stoicism didn't come from the emperor. It came from a man who never had anything to lose in the first place, because he was born a slave. If you want to learn the full life and wisdom of Marcus Aurelius, I have a full video episode linked in the description. Practice 4. Carry your goods within. In the year 307 BC, the city of Megara was burning. Demetrius Poliorcetes, one of the most feared military commanders of the post-Alexander world, a man they called the Besieger, had turned his war machines on this small city nestled between Athens and Corinth. And Megara, which had endured centuries of Greek history, which had produced poets and philosophers and traders, was being systematically destroyed. Homes were torched, temples were looted, libraries were scattered to the wind. The citizens who weren't killed were fleeing into the countryside with whatever they could carry. The smoke rose so high it was said to be visible from Athens. And in the middle of this apocalypse, a man walked calmly out of the ruins. His name was Stilpo. He was the most famous philosopher in Megara, a teacher known across the Greek world for his sharp mind, his gentle humor, and his ability to reduce the most complex problems to their simplest truth. His school had been destroyed. His home was ash. Everything he had accumulated over a lifetime of teaching and living was gone. Demetrius the Conqueror was curious about this philosopher he'd heard so much about. When the fighting died down, he summoned Stilpo and asked him a question. "Have you lost anything?" And Stilpo looked at the man who had just destroyed his city, his home and his possessions and said, "No, I have all my goods with me." Think about that for a moment. A man standing in the ashes of everything he owned, looking his destroyer in the eye, and declaring that he had lost nothing. Because everything that truly mattered, his wisdom, his character, his virtue, his capacity for thought, his philosophical training, none of it could be carried off by soldiers. None of it could be burned. None of it could be looted. Seneca, writing centuries later, couldn't help but admire this moment. He wrote, "The enemy conquered the city, but Stilpo conquered the conqueror." And here's the detail that makes this story even more remarkable. Stilpo wasn't just some abstract thinker disconnected from the world. He was a teacher. A man who had spent his life building something. A school, a community of students, a body of philosophical work. All of it was physically destroyed. But the ideas walked out of Megara in Stilpo's mind, completely intact. One of those ideas walked out in the mind of a young student who had sat at Stilpo's feet. A young man from Cyprus who had come to Megara to study. A young man who would later lose everything himself in a shipwreck, and use that loss to found a new philosophy. His name was Zeno. Yes, that Zeno, the one from our second practice. Stilpo was Zeno's teacher. The man who taught the founder of Stoicism was the man who demonstrated, in the most literal way possible, that your true possessions are invisible. The thread between these stories isn't coincidence, it's inheritance. Stilpo taught Zeno that wisdom cannot be stolen. Zeno proved it by losing everything at sea and building an entire philosophy from the wreckage. The lesson passed from teacher to student, like a flame passed from torch to torch. So, here's the practice, and I know it sounds simple, maybe even obvious, but sit with it for a moment. What you truly own, not your house, that can burn, flood, or be foreclosed. Not your savings, markets crash, banks fail, economies collapse. Not your reputation, other people control that. Not your health, your body changes without your permission. Not even your relationships, other people have their own free will, their own choices, their own paths. What you own, what you really own, is what you carry within you. Your wisdom, your experiences, the lessons you've learned, the character you've built through every difficulty you've survived, your ability to think, to reason, to choose your response, your capacity for kindness, courage, and integrity. If someone took everything from you tonight, every possession, every title, every external marker of who you think you are, what would remain? What would walk out of the wreckage? That's what Stilpo was pointing to. That's the practice. Build your wealth inside. Invest in your character, your understanding, your peace of mind. These are the goods that no conqueror, no crisis, no twist of fate can ever take from you. Stilpo proved that true wealth is what you carry inside. But the Stoics didn't just accept discomfort. They chose it, deliberately, on purpose. And one man took this further than anyone thought possible. Practice 5. Voluntary discomfort. Marcus Porcius Cato was born in 95 BC into one of Rome's most aristocratic families. His great-grandfather was Cato the Elder, the famous senator whose every speech ended with the same declaration: Carthage must be destroyed. Young Cato had wealth. He had connections. He had access to every luxury the Roman Republic could provide. And he chose to suffer. Not because he was masochistic, not because he was performing, but because he understood something that modern comfort culture has completely forgotten. Comfort is not strength. Comfort is the slow, gentle erosion of your capacity to endure. And the day you need to endure, the day the world actually tests you, if you've spent your life wrapped in softness, you will shatter. Cato walked barefoot in the Roman Senate. Where senators wore pristine white togas and polished shoes, Cato arrived with bare feet, calloused and dusty. He wasn't making a fashion statement, he was making a philosophical one. He was saying, I do not need shoes, I do not need the comforts you depend on. I have tested myself against their absence, and I am still here. He wore clothing that invited ridicule, dark garments when everyone else wore white, simple fabric when everyone else wore fine wool. He did this on purpose, because he wanted to practice something terrifying, being mocked, being judged, being laughed at, and not caring. Because if you can survive ridicule, if you can walk through a room full of people laughing at your clothes and not flinch, then what power does social approval hold over you? None. He ate poor man's bread, drank the cheapest wine, slept on hard ground when soft beds were available. He once marched through the North African desert, leading 10,000 men on foot from Berenice to Leptis, sharing every hardship his soldiers endured. No horse, no litter, no special provisions for the general. just bare feet on burning sand, the same as the lowest-ranking soldier. Now here's what's crucial. Cato wasn't a hermit. He wasn't living in a cave. He was one of the richest, most powerful men in Rome. He could have lived in total luxury. He chose discomfort while surrounded by comfort. That's the key. It's not about poverty. It's about choosing hardship when you don't have to. Seneca, writing a century later, formalized this practice beautifully. In his 18th letter, he wrote, "Set aside a certain number of days, during which you shall be content with the scantiest and cheapest fare, with coarse and rough dress, saying to yourself the while, 'Is this the condition that I feared?'" Is this the condition that I feared? That question is everything. Because most of our anxiety comes from imagined discomfort. We fear poverty. We fear hardship. We fear losing our comforts. But we've never actually tested ourselves against those fears. We've never voluntarily experienced the thing we're afraid of. Cato tested himself every single day, and because he had already endured voluntarily what most men feared involuntarily, nothing could break him. When exile threatened, he didn't flinch. He'd already practiced living with nothing. When war came, he didn't waver. He'd already marched through deserts barefoot. When death itself arrived. But we'll get to that story later. Modern science has a name for this principle. It's called hormesis. Small doses of stress make biological systems stronger. Cold exposure strengthens your immune system. Fasting improves metabolic health. Physical strain builds muscle. The Stoics understood hormesis 2,000 years before we had a word for it. And here's the beautiful irony that modern self-help completely misses. Self-help tells you to seek comfort. Build your comfort zone. Create a life of ease. The Stoics say the opposite. The more comfortable you are, the more fragile you become. The practice isn't to eliminate comfort from your life. It's to voluntarily step outside it, regularly, deliberately, with purpose, so that when life forces you outside it, you're not destroyed. Cold showers, fasting, sleeping on the floor once a month, walking when you could drive, eating simply when you could eat lavishly. These aren't punishments, they're training. They're the philosopher's gym. And the muscles you're building aren't physical, they're psychological. Resilience, adaptability, the deep, quiet confidence that comes from knowing, whatever happens, I can handle it. Because I've already proven that to myself. Cato proved it barefoot in the desert. Seneca proved it in voluntary poverty while being the richest man in Rome. Marcus Aurelius proved it sleeping on the ground at age 12. The practice: choose one small discomfort this week, skip a meal, take a cold shower, walk instead of driving, sleep without your pillow. And when the discomfort hits, ask yourself Seneca's question: is this the condition that I feared? You might be surprised by the answer. Cato chose discomfort. He chose the hard road deliberately. But there was a Stoic teacher who didn't just endure hardship. He revolutionized who was allowed to practice philosophy, and it nearly got him killed. Practice 6. Radical equality. In the 1st century AD, in the imperial heart of Rome, a teacher was saying things that made powerful men uncomfortable. His name was Gaius Musonius Rufus. History would remember him as the Roman Socrates. Not because he looked like Socrates, not because he wrote like Socrates, but because, like Socrates, he had an infuriating habit of telling the truth to people who did not want to hear it. And like Socrates, it would cost him everything, more than once. Musonius Rufus argued publicly, loudly, and repeatedly that women should study philosophy. Now, I need you to understand how radical this was. This was 1st century Rome. Women were considered legal property of their fathers, then their husbands. They couldn't vote. They couldn't hold office. They had limited property rights. The idea that women should study philosophy, the highest intellectual pursuit of the ancient world, was not just unconventional. It was scandalous. But Musonius didn't just suggest it politely. He built an argument for it. He said that since women have the same capacity for reason as men, and since virtue requires reason, and since philosophy teaches virtue, then denying women philosophy was denying them their nature. It was denying them the chance to become fully human. 2,000 years before the suffrage movement. 2,000 years before women's rights entered mainstream consciousness. A Roman teacher in the heart of an empire built on patriarchy was arguing for intellectual equality. And that's not even the most remarkable thing about him. Musonius was exiled 3 times. 3 times! By 3 different emperors. Nero exiled him first, around 65 AD, for his association with the Stoic opposition, the group of senators and philosophers who refused to bow to Nero's tyranny. Then Vespasian exiled him. Then Domitian. 3 emperors saw this man as enough of a threat to remove him from Rome. His most famous exile sent him to the island of Gyaros, a tiny, barren rock in the Aegean Sea that the Romans used as a prison colony. It was considered one of the worst postings in the empire, barely habitable, almost waterless. And here is what Musonius did on that waterless, barren prison island. He found water. He actually discovered a freshwater spring that nobody had known about. The man they sent to a wasteland to die quietly improved the wasteland. He turned his punishment into a project, his exile into an exploration. But more importantly, he taught, even on Gyaros, even as a prisoner, even when the audience was other exiles and the occasional visiting official, Musonius taught philosophy. He couldn't not teach. It was who he was. The Stoic practice of living philosophically wasn't something Musonius did when conditions were right. It was something he did regardless of conditions. In Rome, in exile, in prison, on a barren island in the middle of the sea. His students adored him, and his most famous student would become the most influential Stoic teacher in history. A former slave named Epictetus, the same Epictetus we met in our 3rd practice, studied under Musonius Rufus. The chain of transmission is direct. Musonius taught the slave who would teach the philosophy that would sustain an emperor. There's one more story about Musonius that I can't leave out. During one of the civil conflicts that periodically tore Rome apart, Musonius walked, unarmed, between 2 advancing armies. He began lecturing on the futility of war and the philosophy of peace. Some accounts say that soldiers actually stopped fighting and sat down to listen. Others say the armies moved on and ignored him. Either way, he walked between 2 armies with nothing but words and conviction. That takes a kind of courage that's hard to even imagine. Musonius taught that philosophy isn't something you study. It's something you do, every day, in every situation. It belongs to everyone, man or woman, rich or poor, free or enslaved. And nobody, not an emperor, not an army, not the entire machinery of Roman power, has the right to decide who gets to pursue wisdom. The practice, wisdom belongs to everyone. Share it freely. Don't gatekeep it behind degrees, credentials, or social status. And don't wait for perfect conditions to practice it. Practice it now, in whatever circumstances you find yourself, on whatever barren island life has dropped you on. Because if a 3-time exile could teach philosophy from a prison island in the Aegean Sea, what's your excuse? Musonius proved that age, gender, and station don't determine who deserves wisdom. But there was another Stoic who proved something even more radical, that it's never too late to begin. Practice 7. It's never too late. Around the year 280 BC, in the city of Assos, a small town on the coast of what is now Turkey, there lived a man named Cleanthes. He was not a philosopher. He was a boxer, a prize fighter, a man who made his living with his fists. And he was getting old. We don't know exactly when Cleanthes was born, but most scholars place it around 330 BC, which means he arrived in Athens somewhere around the age of 50. 50 years old, in an era when the average life expectancy was far shorter than today. A former boxer with calloused hands, no formal education, no money, and no connections. He walked into Athens, the intellectual capital of the ancient world, a city crawling with brilliant young men who had been studying philosophy since childhood. And he decided he wanted to learn. Now, imagine this. You're 50. You've spent your life punching people. Your hands are scarred. Your ears are probably cauliflowered. And every philosopher in the city is 30 years younger than you and has been reading Plato since they could hold a scroll. What do? Cleanthes didn't care. He enrolled in Zeno's school, the Painted Porch, the birthplace of Stoicism. And here's where the story gets remarkable. He had no money, none. He couldn't pay for tuition. He couldn't even afford papyrus to take notes. So he worked. At night, as a water carrier, he hauled water from wells to gardens and bathhouses, bucket by bucket, through the dark streets of Athens, earning just enough to eat and pay for his studies during the day. By day, he sat at the feet of Zeno, absorbing every word. By night, he carried water. And when he needed to take notes, when something Zeno said was too important to risk forgetting, Cleanthes wrote it down on oyster shells and ox shoulder blades, because that's what he could find for free. Oyster shells. Let that image settle in your mind. One of the most important figures in the history of philosophy, taking notes on the discarded shells of someone else's dinner. The Athenians noticed this man. Of course they did. A 50-year-old ex-boxer, carrying water all night and studying philosophy all day, was not a common sight, and they were suspicious. The Areopagus, Athens' highest council, actually hauled Cleanthes before them. They demanded to know how he supported himself. In Athens, if you couldn't prove you had a legitimate income, you could be expelled as a vagrant. Cleanthes held up his hands, his calloused, water-scarred hands, and he called witnesses, the garden owner he carried water for, the woman whose flour he needed on the side. The court was so impressed by his industry that they voted to award him 10 minas from the public treasury. Zeno told him not to accept it. Cleanthes didn't. He went back to carrying water. He studied under Zeno for nearly 2 decades, and when Zeno died around 262 BC, the Stoic school needed a new leader, a new head of the most important philosophical school in the Western world. They could have chosen any of the brilliant young minds who had been groomed for years. They chose Cleanthes, the old boxer, the water carrier, the man who took notes on oyster shells. And Cleanthes didn't just keep the school alive. He wrote the Hymn to Zeus, considered one of the greatest pieces of philosophical poetry in the ancient world, a soaring, beautiful meditation on the divine order of the universe and humanity's place within it. Critics have compared it to the Psalms, this from a man who couldn't afford paper. Cleanthes led the Stoic school for over 30 years. He kept its teachings alive through a period when other schools were trying to dismantle Stoicism from every angle. His successor, Chrysippus, would systematize Stoic logic into a comprehensive philosophy. But without Cleanthes bridging the gap between Zeno and Chrysippus, Stoicism might not have survived at all. He died around 230 BC, reportedly at the age of 99 or 100. One account says he starved himself to death after an ulcer prevented him from eating. When friends urged him to eat, he said he'd already started his journey and wouldn't turn back. Even his death was a Stoic exercise. So here's the practice, and it's devastatingly simple. Begin. That's it. Whatever you've been putting off, whatever dream you've been telling yourself you're too old for, too late for, too far behind for, begin. Cleanthes was 50. He was a boxer. He had nothing. And he became one of the most important philosophers who ever lived. We live in a culture that worships youth, that tells you everything must happen by 30 by 40, by some arbitrary deadline that has no basis in reality. Cleanthes didn't get the memo. He started at 50, wrote on shells, and led a school that shaped the next 2,000 years of Western thought. You don't need perfect conditions. You don't need money. You don't need youth. You don't even need papyrus. You need one thing, the willingness to begin, right where you are, with whatever you have, even if it's just an oyster shell and a stubborn refusal to quit. It's never too late. Not for Cleanthes at 50. Not for you tonight. Cleanthes proved you're never too old to transform your life. But the next practice is about something more dangerous than poverty or age. It's about standing up for what you believe, even when the most powerful man in the world wants you dead. Practice 8. Speak truth to power. In the 1st century AD, in the imperial court of Rome, an emperor was losing his patience with a senator who would not shut up. The emperor was Vespasian, a soldier emperor, a practical man who had clawed his way to power through civil war. He was not by nature a cruel man. He was tough, direct, and mostly reasonable, but he was the emperor, and emperors expected obedience. The senator was Helvidius Priscus, a Stoic, a man whose entire identity was built on one simple principle: you say what you believe, regardless of the consequences. No matter who's listening, no matter what it costs. Helvidius was not some obscure troublemaker. He was married to the daughter of Paete, another Stoic senator who had openly defied Emperor Nero and paid for it with his life. Helvidius had watched his father-in-law choose death over silence. He had seen what speaking truth to power costs, and he had decided the cost is worth paying. The exchange between Helvidius and Vespasian is one of the most remarkable dialogues in Stoic history. Epictetus, who was alive during this period, records it in his discourses. The conversation went something like this. Vespasian told Helvidius not to attend the Senate. Helvidius replied, "It is in your power not to allow me to be a senator, but as long as I am one, I must attend." Vespasian said, "Very well, attend but say nothing." Helvidius replied, "Do not ask my opinion, and I will be silent. But if you ask, I must say what seems right to me." Vespasian, "But if you speak, I shall put you to death." And Helvidius looked at the most powerful man in the world and said, "When did I ever tell you that I am immortal? You will do your part, and I will do mine. It is your part to kill. It is mine to die without flinching. Your part to exile. Mine to leave without sorrow." When did I ever tell you that I am immortal? Read that again. Let it settle. A mortal man, fully aware that he is mortal, using that very mortality as his shield. He's not claiming divine protection. He's not threatening the emperor with political consequences. He's simply saying, "I know the price. I've calculated it. I accept it. Do what you must. I will do what I must." This is Stoic courage at its most refined. It's not the courage of a warrior charging into battle on adrenaline. It's the courage of a man sitting calmly across from his own death, reasoning with it, accepting it, and refusing to let it change his behavior. Vespasian, to his credit, was deeply troubled by Helvidius. He reportedly sent messengers to countermand the execution order, but they arrived too late. Helvidius was already dead. Now here's what makes this story more than just an isolated act of defiance. Helvidius wasn't alone. He was part of what historians call the Stoic opposition, a multi-generational network of philosophers and senators who stood up to one emperor after another. Paetus defied Nero. Helvidius defied Vespasian. Aurelius Rusticus defied Domitian. 3 generations, 3 emperors. And the thread of Stoic courage ran through all of them. And here's the detail that ties everything together. Aurelius Rusticus, the man who defied Domitian, had a grandson. That grandson became the Stoic tutor of a young boy named Marcus Aurelius. The philosopher-emperor we met in our first practice. The line runs directly. Paetus, killed by Nero. His son-in-law, Helvidius, killed by Vespasian. Their philosophical heir, Rusticus, killed by Domitian. Rusticus's grandson, teaching the future emperor of Rome. 3 generations of martyrs produced the teacher who shaped the most Stoic emperor in history. That's not just courage. That's legacy. That's ideas surviving because people were willing to die for them. So here's the practice. And no, I'm not suggesting you defy an emperor tomorrow morning. But I am suggesting this. There are moments in your life, at work, in relationships, in your community, where silence is the easy choice, where agreeing is the comfortable path, where keeping your head down protects you from consequences. Helvidius teaches that some truths are worth the cost of speaking them. The practice isn't reckless honesty. It's considered honesty. Know what you believe. Know the cost of saying it. Accept that cost. And then speak. Not everyone will face an emperor across a table, but everyone faces moments where they can speak truth or stay silent. Helvidius chose to speak. His father-in-law chose to speak. 3 generations of their family chose to speak. And their words, preserved by Epictetus, inherited by Marcus Aurelius, echoed louder than any emperor's decree. The practice. Identify your truth. Calculate the cost. Accept it. And speak. Helvidius spoke truth to power and paid with his life. But the next story is about a kind of courage that goes even deeper. A courage so extreme, so intimate, that it was expressed not in words to an emperor, but in 3 quiet words to the person she loved most. Practice 9. Courage Beyond Words. In the year 42 AD, a Roman noblewoman named Arria sat by her husband's bedside. His name was Paetus. He was gravely ill, fevered, delirious, barely aware of his surroundings, and he did not know, could not know, that their son had just died. The boy had fallen ill at the same time as his father. And while Paetus lay in his fever, lost in the fog between consciousness and oblivion, the boy's condition worsened, and then quietly he was gone. Now, put yourself in Arria's position. Your son has just died. Your husband is critically ill. If he learns that the boy is dead, the grief could kill him. The shock could stop his recovery before it begins. What do you do? Arria made a choice that Pliny the Younger, the man who would later record this story, called the greatest act of courage he had ever heard of. Greater, even, than the famous act that would come later. She arranged her son's funeral. In secret, she organized the rites, said the prayers, handled the preparations, all without her husband's knowledge. And then, every single day, she walked into Paetus's sick room, and she smiled. She told him the boy was doing better, that he'd eaten well, that he was sleeping peacefully. She described his improving health with the steady voice of a mother reporting good news. She answered every question with warmth and optimism. And then she walked out of the room, found a private corner, and wept every single day for weeks, until Paetus recovered enough to bear the truth. Now, I know the famous part of Arria's story is coming. The dagger, the 3 words, and yes, that moment is extraordinary. But Pliny was right to argue that this was the greater courage, because the dagger was a single act, a moment of supreme resolve. But this, the daily performance of normalcy, the daily suppression of devastating grief, the daily choice to carry that weight alone so that someone she loved wouldn't be crushed by it, this was a marathon of courage, invisible courage, the kind no one writes poems about, the kind no one sees. Years passed. Paetus recovered. But the world kept turning, and in 42 AD, an event occurred that would test Arria's courage once more. Paetus was implicated in a rebellion against Emperor Claudius. The rebellion failed. Paetus was condemned to death. But Roman custom allowed condemned men of noble birth to choose the manner of their death. Suicide was considered the honorable option. It preserved the family's property and dignity. But Paetus hesitated, not because he was a coward. Facing death with a sword in your hand, knowing you must use it on yourself, is not easy. The body rebels. The survival instinct screams. Even the bravest men have faltered at this threshold. Arria saw her husband's hesitation, and she made another choice. She took the dagger, she looked at the man she had nursed through illness, the man she had protected from grief, the man she had loved through decades of Roman life. And she plunged the blade into her own chest. Then she pulled it out, and she handed it to him, dripping with her own blood. And she said 3 words, Paete, non dolet. Paetus, it does not hurt. 3 words, in Latin, spoken by a dying woman to the man she loved, to give him the courage to follow. It does not hurt, I've gone first. You can do this. I'm showing you it can be done. Those 3 words became the most famous phrase in Roman literature. Martial wrote about them. Pliny immortalized them. They were quoted for centuries as the supreme example of Roman courage. But here's what moves me most about Arria's story. It's not the dagger. It's the totality of her courage. the concealment of her son's death. That took weeks of invisible bravery. The daily performance of hope, while drowning in grief, that took a strength most of us can barely imagine. And the final act with the dagger, that was just the visible peak of a mountain of courage that had been building for years. The practice isn't be willing to die. The practice is courage is most often quiet. It's most often invisible. It's the parent who holds it together for their children during a divorce. The friend who shows up with a smile when they're privately falling apart. The caretaker who radiates calm while carrying unbearable weight. Arria's 3 words mean something beyond their literal content. They mean, I will go first. I will show you it can be done. I will carry this weight so you don't have to carry it alone. That is Stoic courage. Not the absence of fear, not dramatic heroism. The quiet, daily, invisible choice to be strong for someone else, to carry what needs carrying, to go first. When prevented from suicide on a later occasion, Arria reportedly ran headfirst into a wall, telling her guards, "Did you think you could prevent me? I told you I'd find a harder way." Her granddaughter Fannia preserved these stories for Pliny the Younger, ensuring that Arria's courage would survive the centuries. The practice, sometimes courage means going first, showing someone it can be done. Carrying weight silently so others can heal. Not all courage comes with an audience. Some of the bravest acts with an audience. Some of the bravest acts in history happened in bedrooms, in sick rooms, in the quiet moments between 2 people who loved each other. Arria proved that courage lives in the quiet moments. But our next practice confronts the loudest, most terrifying reality of all, the one we all try to ignore: death itself. Practice 10. Memento Mori. Remember you must die. In ancient Rome, when a general won a great victory, when he conquered a nation, crushed an army, expanded the borders of the empire, he was granted the highest honor the Republic could bestow, a triumph, a grand procession through the streets of Rome, cheering crowds, trumpets, captured enemies in chains. The general himself rode in a golden chariot, his face painted red like the god Jupiter, wearing a purple toga embroidered with gold. It was the closest a mortal man could come to being treated as a god. But there was a tradition within this ceremony that most people forget. Behind the general, standing in the chariot, was a slave, and that slave had one job, one responsibility. Throughout the entire procession, while the crowd screamed, while the senators bowed, while the general basked in the greatest glory a Roman could achieve, the slave leaned forward and whispered into his ear, "Memento Mori." Remember, you must die. Respis post te, hominem te memento. Look behind you. Remember that you are a man. In the moment of greatest triumph, a reminder of death. In the moment when ego could soar to the heavens, a whisper pulling it back to earth. The Romans understood something that modern culture has completely lost. Death isn't the enemy of a good life. Forgetting death is. And no one in the ancient world embodied this practice more completely, more brutally, more dramatically than Marcus Porcius Cato, the man we met in our 5th practice, the man who walked barefoot through the desert, the man who chose discomfort when comfort was available, because now we need to talk about how he died. It was 46 BC, The Roman Republic was falling apart. Julius Caesar had crossed the Rubicon, defeated his rivals, and was consolidating power with terrifying speed. One by one, the defenders of the Republic surrendered, compromised, or were destroyed. Pompey was dead. The senators were capitulating. The old order was crumbling. And Cato was the last man standing. He had retreated to Utica, a city in North Africa, with a small force of Republican loyalists. Caesar's army was closing in. Cato's allies begged him to negotiate, to surrender. Caesar himself had made it known that he would spare Cato's life. He wanted to pardon Cato. A public pardon of his most noble enemy would make Caesar look merciful, magnanimous, godlike. Cato understood this perfectly, and that's precisely why he refused. See, Cato didn't refuse because he was too proud to accept mercy. He refused because he understood the trap. If he accepted Caesar's pardon, he would be admitting that Caesar had the authority to pardon, that Caesar was the source of mercy, that the Republic was dead and Caesar was its replacement. By living on Caesar's terms, Cato would validate everything he'd spent his life opposing. So he chose death, not impulsively, not in despair, with the deliberate, calculated clarity of a man who had practiced Memento Mori every day of his life. The final evening of Cato's life is one of the most extraordinary scenes in ancient history. He dined with friends, he discussed philosophy, and then he retired to his room and read Plato's Phaedo, the dialogue in which Socrates discusses the immortality of the soul on the eve of his own execution. Cato read it. Then he read it again. The whole thing. Twice. At some point during the evening, he noticed that his sword had been removed from the room. His friends, fearing what he planned, had quietly taken it away. Cato erupted. He called for the sword. When his friends refused, he raged, "Am I such a madman that I cannot find other means of dying? I could hold my breath. I could dash my head against the wall. I could throw myself from a window. Do you think you need to guard me like a child?" The sword was returned. In the deep hours of the night, Cato unsheathed the blade, and he drove it into his own abdomen. But the wound, though severe, was not immediately fatal. His friends heard the crash and rushed in. They found him on the floor, his intestines protruding, but still alive. A physician was called. The doctor pushed the intestines back into the body cavity. He stitched the wound. He bandaged it. Cato waited. He waited until the doctor left. He waited until his friends relaxed their guard. And then, with a calm that terrified everyone who witnessed it, he reached down and ripped the stitches out. He tore open the wound with his bare hands. He pulled out his own entrails. And then he died. When Julius Caesar received the news, he was reportedly overcome with emotion. The great dictator, the man who had conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, defeated every enemy, looked at the report of Cato's death and said, "Cato, I envy you your death, as you envied me the chance to spare your life." Even Caesar recognized the magnitude of what Cato had done. In refusing mercy, Cato had achieved something Caesar never could, a death entirely on his own terms, a death that would echo through the centuries as the ultimate act of principled defiance. Now, I want to be clear about something. The practice of Memento Mori is not about suicide. It is not about seeking death or romanticizing it. What Cato did was extreme, a product of his specific historical moment, his specific philosophical convictions, and the specific political crisis of the dying Roman Republic. The practice is much simpler and much more useful. Memento Mori means remember that you are going to die. Not someday in the abstract, not eventually. You, the person hearing this right now, will one day cease to exist. Your heart will beat for the last time. You will take your last breath, and everything you've been putting off, everything you've been waiting for, everything you've been postponing for later will have run out. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think." Seneca wrote, "You may not wake up tomorrow. You may not see the sunset. You may not finish your next sentence." Epictetus told his students, "I must die. Must I die groaning? I must be imprisoned. Must I be imprisoned complaining? I must be exiled. Can anyone prevent me from going with a smile, with courage, and at peace?" The point isn't to be morbid. The point is to be clear. Death is the great clarifier. When you remember that you're going to die, everything trivial falls away. The petty grudge you've been holding. You don't have time for it. The dream you've been postponing. Start it now. The person you've been meaning to call them tonight. The life you've been meaning to live. This is it. There is no other one. Cato faced death with a Roman's resolve. But the practice isn't about how you die. It's about how you live. Once you remember that the clock is ticking. The Roman slave in the chariot had it right all along. Behind every triumph, behind every success, behind every moment of joy. The whisper is there. Memento Mori. Remember you must die. Not to frighten you, to free you. Cato faced death with raw physical courage. But the next practice is about facing death every single day, not at the end of your life, but at the beginning of every night. It's the practice of a man who knew he'd die at his emperor's command, and used that knowledge to live more fully than anyone around him. Practice 11, Premeditatio Malorum, the premeditation of adversity. And so we come to our 11th practice, to perhaps the most complicated, contradictory, fascinating human being in the entire Stoic tradition. His name was Lucius Annaeus Seneca, and his life story reads like a novel that no editor would believe. Seneca was born around the year 4 BC in Corduba, in what is now southern Spain. He was sickly from childhood, plagued by respiratory problems, possibly tuberculosis, possibly severe asthma. There were periods when he was so ill, so wasted by disease, so depleted by coughing and wheezing, that he later admitted the only thing that kept him from killing himself was the thought of his aging father's grief. Read that again. The man who would become the most eloquent writer in the Stoic tradition was kept alive in his youth, not by philosophy, but by love. His family moved to Rome when Seneca was young. He studied rhetoric and philosophy, showing extraordinary talent. But his health continued to betray him. He was sent to Egypt for nearly a decade, partly for his aunt's political connections, partly because the dry climate might help his lungs. When he returned to Rome, he entered politics and began making a name as a brilliant orator and writer. And then the trouble started. In 41 AD, Emperor Claudius, or more precisely, Claudius's wife Messalina, had Seneca exiled to the island of Corsica on charges of adultery with the emperor's niece. Most historians believe the charges were false. Seneca was a political threat, and exile was a convenient way to neutralize him. For 8 years, Seneca lived on Corsica. 8 years on a remote, barely civilized island. Away from Rome, away from power, away from everything he'd built. He wrote letters. He wrote philosophical essays. He wrestled with grief, with anger, with the injustice of his situation. And slowly, painfully, he began to practice what he preached. Because here's the thing about Seneca that makes him different from every other Stoic philosopher. He wasn't born a slave, like Epictetus. He wasn't born into hardship, like Cleanthes. He wasn't a reluctant emperor, like Marcus Aurelius. Seneca was brilliant, ambitious, worldly, and very, very human. He struggled with the philosophy he taught. He fell short of his own ideals. And he was honest about it. "I am not wise," he wrote, "and I shall not be wise, so require of me not that I equal the best, but that I am better than the worst." This is what makes Seneca extraordinary. He didn't pretend to be perfect. He didn't claim to be a sage. He was a man trying to be better. And his honesty about that struggle has made him the most accessible, most relatable, most human of all the Stoic philosophers. In 49 AD, everything changed again. Claudius's new wife Agrippina had Seneca recalled from exile, but not out of kindness. She had a plan. She needed a tutor for her 12-year-old son, a boy named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, a boy the world would come to know as Nero. Seneca became Nero's teacher. And for a few years, the early years of Nero's reign, from 54 to roughly 62 AD, Seneca effectively ran the Roman Empire. He was advisor, speechwriter, and moral compass to a young emperor who, for a brief window, actually governed well. Those years are sometimes called the Quinquennium Neronis, the 5 good years, and much of the credit goes to Seneca. But Nero was changing, growing more erratic, more violent, more suspicious. The boy Seneca had taught was becoming a monster, and Seneca knew it. He saw the trajectory, he tried to moderate it, and when he couldn't, he tried to withdraw. Meanwhile, Seneca had become fabulously wealthy, the richest man in Rome by some accounts. Modern estimates put his fortune at the equivalent of roughly $2 billion. He owned estates across the empire. He lent money at enormous interest rates. He lived in luxury while writing essays about the virtues of poverty and simplicity. The paradox is glaring, and Seneca's critics, both ancient and modern, have never let him forget it. How can you preach Stoic simplicity while sitting on a mountain of gold? Seneca's answer was characteristically honest. He never claimed to be indifferent to wealth. He claimed to be indifferent to the loss of wealth. There's a difference. Owning things isn't the problem. Being owned by things is. Seneca argued that a wise man can enjoy wealth without depending on it, that the test isn't whether you have money, it's whether you could lose it all and still be yourself. And soon enough, that test would come. In 65 AD, a group of senators and nobles hatched a plot to assassinate Nero. The Pisonian conspiracy, it would be called. Whether Seneca was actively involved is debated by historians to this day, but Nero didn't care about nuance. He wanted Seneca dead. An officer arrived at Seneca's villa with the order: death by suicide, the Roman way. Seneca could choose his method, but the outcome was non-negotiable. And now we arrive at one of the most extraordinary death scenes in all of ancient literature. Seneca gathered his friends. He spoke to them. He consoled them, the people who had come to watch him die. He reminded them of everything he'd taught. He asked them to remember his philosophy, not his wealth. He asked them to draw from the lessons they'd shared together. Then he turned to his wife, Paulina. She was young. She loved him. and she declared that she would die with him. Seneca tried to dissuade her. He argued that she had life ahead of her, that she should live and remember him, and find whatever comfort the future could offer. But Paulina was resolute. She said her life without him would be a kind of death anyway. So they cut their wrists together. But Seneca's body, old, weakened by years of illness, thinned by his ascetic diet, would not cooperate. The blood flowed slowly, too slowly. He cut the veins in his legs, still too slow. He drank hemlock, the poison that had killed Socrates 400 years earlier. It had no effect. His body was so cold, so depleted, that the poison couldn't circulate. Meanwhile, Nero, perhaps moved by some last flicker of conscience, or perhaps just seeing political advantage in mercy, sent word that Paulina should be saved. Guards rushed in. They bandaged her wrists. She survived, though she carried the scars for the rest of her life. He dictated. He called for his scribes, and he dictated philosophical observations about death, about the soul, about the nature of consciousness as it dims. He was studying his own death, using his final moments as one last experiment, one last lesson, one last exercise in philosophical observation. Tacitus, who recorded the scene, notes that Seneca sprinkled water on the nearest servants as a final libation, a religious offering, saying, "This is for Jupiter, the liberator." And then he was gone. The wealthiest man in Rome, the advisor to an emperor, the most prolific writer in the Stoic tradition. Dead in a steam bath, at his own hand, on the orders of the student he'd tried and failed to mould into a good ruler. Seneca was carried into a steam bath. The heat finally opened his veins, and as the steam filled the room, as his life slowly drained away, Seneca did something that still staggers me every time I think about it. Now, Premeditatio Malorum, this was Seneca's signature practice, the one he wrote about more extensively than any other. And here's why. Seneca wrote in his letters, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." Think about that. Most of the things that keep you awake at night, the catastrophes, the worst-case scenarios, the midnight anxieties, most of them never happen. And the ones that do happen, they're usually not as bad as you imagined. And even when they are as bad as you imagined, you handle them. Because human beings are astonishingly resilient when they're actually facing reality, rather than imagining it. But here's where the practice gets subtle. Seneca doesn't say, "Don't worry." He doesn't say, "Think positive." He says the opposite. Think about the bad thing. Deliberately, on purpose. Sit with it. Visualize it. Ask yourself, what's the worst that could happen? And then, how would I handle it? Set before your mind's eye, Seneca wrote, the possibility of exile, torture, war, and shipwreck. Rehearse them in your thoughts. And then you will find that none of them is as fearful as their reputation suggests. This is not catastrophizing. Catastrophizing is uncontrolled worry that spirals without resolution. Premeditatio Malorum is controlled visualization that ends in preparedness. You look at the worst case. You mentally rehearse your response. And then, and this is critical, you let it go. You've prepared. You've rehearsed. Now you can rest. And here is the profound connection to tonight, to this moment, to you lying here, listening to these stories. Every night, your mind does a version of this, but badly, uncontrolled. It cycles through worries. It replays conversations. It projects disasters. It keeps you awake with imagined emergencies that may never arrive. The Stoic practice takes that same mental energy and gives it structure. Before you sleep, take 5 minutes. Ask yourself, what's worrying me? What could go wrong tomorrow? And for each worry, what would I do if it happened? How would I respond? Then release it. You've done the work. You've prepared your inner citadel. You've acknowledged what's in your control and what isn't. And now, there is nothing more to do. The night is yours. The worry has been given its audience. It's been heard, processed, and dismissed. Oxford researchers found that structured mental imagery before bed helps insomniacs fall asleep significantly faster. Baylor University sleep researchers found that writing a specific to-do list for just 5 minutes before bed helped people fall asleep 9 minutes faster, because it offloads tomorrow's concerns from the mind. The science confirms what Seneca discovered 2,000 years ago in exile on Corsica, in the palaces of Rome, and in the steam of his own death. When you face your fears deliberately, they lose their power to haunt you. Seneca's death was the ultimate Premeditatio Malorum. He had rehearsed it mentally for decades. He had written about it in letters and essays. He had told his friends over and over, death is nothing to fear. It is a return, a release, a transformation. And when the moment finally came, when the order arrived from Nero, when the blade touched his skin, Seneca was ready. Not because he was fearless, but because he had looked fear in the eye so many times that it had no surprise left to offer. That's the practice. That's the final gift of the Stoics. Not the elimination of fear, but the domestication of it, the conversion of wild, uncontrolled anxiety into structured, purposeful preparation, and after the preparation, peace. Seneca wrote, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a great deal of it. Life is long enough, and a sufficiently generous amount has been given to us for the highest achievements if it were all well invested." And across the stories we have heard tonight, an emperor, a slave, a merchant, a boxer, a senator, a teacher, a woman, a soldier, each one discovered the same truth from a different direction. You cannot control what happens to you, but you can control who you become in response. Now, nightlings, I told you there were 11 practices, 11 stories from the ancient Stoics, that modern self-help gets wrong. But as I was gathering these stories for you, I discovered something. The Stoic tradition is so vast, so rich, so layered with human experience, that 11 practices barely scratches the surface. For every Marcus Aurelius whose name echoes through history, there are a dozen brilliant minds whose stories have been nearly forgotten, philosophers who risked everything for their ideas, thinkers who changed the course of human thought, and then vanished into the margins of history books. So, I'm going to share a few more. Consider these the deeper roots, the hidden chapters, the stories that didn't quite make the first list. Not because they're less important, but because the world hasn't given them the attention they deserve. And honestly, some of these might be the ones that change you the most. Because the well-known Stoics, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca, they're extraordinary. But they had something the lesser-known philosophers didn't. They had fame, position, the advantage of being remembered. The philosophers I'm about to introduce you to, they did it the hard way, without the spotlight, without the legacy, with nothing but the quality of their ideas and the courage of their convictions. Let's begin. Now, I want you to imagine something with me for a moment. Imagine a man living in a ceramic jar, not a house, not a tent, a jar, in the middle of the busiest marketplace in ancient Athens. He owns nothing, absolutely nothing. He had a wooden cup once, but he threw that away too, after watching a child drink water from cupped hands and realizing he didn't even need a cup. This is Diogenes. And before you dismiss him as a madman, which, to be fair, plenty of people did, understand that this man might have been the freest human being who ever lived. And the Stoics? They owe him everything. You see, Diogenes wasn't technically a Stoic. He was a cynic, and I should explain that word because it doesn't mean what you think it means. We use cynic today to describe someone bitter and negative. But the original Greek word, kynikos, it means dog-like, and Diogenes chose that label himself. When people asked why he called himself a dog, he said, "I fawn on those who give me anything, bark at those who give nothing, and bite the rogues." He was a philosopher of radical honesty, and he was hilarious. But his story begins with something far less funny. Diogenes was born around 413 BC in Sinope, a city on the Black Sea coast. His father was a banker, a respected man who managed the city's official currency. And then everything fell apart. There was a scandal. Diogenes or his father, the sources aren't entirely clear, was accused of defacing the city's coins, debasing the currency. In the ancient world, that was one of the worst crimes you could commit. It was an attack on the city itself. Diogenes was exiled, cast out, everything he knew gone. And here's where most people would collapse. Here's where you or I might spend years in bitterness, replaying what happened, trying to figure out who to blame. But when someone told Diogenes, "The people of Sinope have condemned you to exile," do you know what he said? He said, "And I condemn them to stay where they are." Just sit with that for a second. Everyone else was trapped in their cities, their routines, their obligations, their possessions. Diogenes, he was free. For the first time in his life, he was truly, completely free. He made his way to Athens. And in Athens he studied under a philosopher named Antisthenes, who was himself a student of Socrates. This is important because it establishes a direct philosophical lineage. Socrates taught Antisthenes. Antisthenes taught Diogenes. Diogenes' student Crates later taught Zeno of Citium. That's right, the founder of Stoicism studied under a student of Diogenes. Stoicism is literally the grandchild of cynicism. Without the man living in a jar, there would be no Marcus Aurelius meditating on a battlefield, no Epictetus teaching from a broken leg, no Seneca writing letters to Lucilius. The entire tradition traces back through this chain to a man who chose to own nothing. Now, the stories about Diogenes in Athens are legendary. And I mean that literally. Some of them might be legends. But they've survived for 2,400 years because they contain truths that legends are built to carry. There's the famous one about Plato. The great philosopher Plato once defined a human being as a featherless biped. Nice and logical, right? Very academic. Diogenes heard this, went and plucked a chicken, brought it into Plato's academy, held up this bare, confused bird, and announced, "Behold, Plato's human being." Plato had to go back and add with broad, flat nails to his definition. It sounds like a prank. And it was a prank, but it was also philosophy. Diogenes was making a point that abstract definitions can miss the entire essence of what they're trying to describe. You can define a human being with logic, or you can simply look at one, live as one, be one. He did things like this constantly. He lit a lantern in broad daylight and walked through the marketplace saying, "I am searching for a human being, not a person. There were plenty of people." He was looking for someone living authentically, someone not hiding behind social masks, someone truly human. But of all the stories about Diogenes, there's one that towers above the rest. Alexander the Great, the most powerful human being on the planet, the man who had conquered virtually the entire known world, came to meet Diogenes in Corinth. Now, think about what that means. The conqueror of nations, seeking out a man who lives in a jar. Alexander found Diogenes sunbathing. He stood over him, casting his shadow across the philosopher's face, and said, with the generosity of someone who literally owns the world, "Ask me for anything you wish." Anything. This was Alexander the Great. He could have given Diogenes a palace, an army, a kingdom, anything a human being could possibly desire. And Diogenes, barely looking up, said, "Stand out of my light. That's it. The one thing I need from you, the most powerful man alive, is for you to stop blocking my sun." Alexander's soldiers laughed, but Alexander himself didn't laugh. He stood there for a long moment and then said something remarkable. He said, "Truly, if I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." The conqueror of the world envied the man who owned nothing. And that is the 12th Stoic practice, knightlings, radical freedom. Not freedom as the world typically defines it, having enough money to do whatever you want. But freedom as Diogenes lived it, needing so little that no one can ever control you. Because here's what modern self-help gets spectacularly wrong about freedom. They'll tell you, achieve financial independence and you'll be free. Build passive income and you'll be free. Optimize your morning routine and you'll be free. But Diogenes would look at all of that and say, "You're still a slave. You're a slave to the idea of freedom. You've just built a more comfortable cage." True freedom, the kind that made Alexander the Great jealous, isn't about having enough. It's about needing less. Diogenes proved this with his entire life. When he was captured by pirates, yes, actual pirates, and sold as a slave, the auctioneer asked him what skills he had. And Diogenes, standing on the auction block in chains, said, "I know how to govern men." He was purchased by a man named Zeno, and Diogenes immediately told his new master, "You must obey me, even though I am a slave, just as you would obey a doctor or a ship's captain." He became, essentially, the tutor of the household. The slave ruled the house. Because you can chain a man's body, you can exile him, you can sell him, but if he needs nothing from you, if his happiness depends on nothing you can give or take, then he was never really yours. Diogenes coined a phrase that we still use today, 2,400 years later. He called himself a cosmopolites, a citizen of the world, not a citizen of Sinope, which had exiled him, not a citizen of Athens, where he lived in a jar, a citizen of the world. He was the first person in recorded history to use that concept. So tonight, as you're lying there, maybe thinking about all the things you need before you can finally be happy, all the goals you have to achieve before you'll feel free. I want you to hear Diogenes whispering from his ceramic jar in the Athenian marketplace. You already have everything you need. You already are free. The only question is, will you believe it? There's a philosophical riddle that's haunted scholars for over 2,000 years. How does a man write 700 books and have none of them survive? Not a single complete work. 700 volumes of philosophy, logic, ethics, physics, an entire library written by one mind. And all of it gone, scattered into fragments, quoted in passing by later writers, referenced in footnotes. The man's name was Chrysippus, and if you've never heard of him, well, that's the tragedy, because without Chrysippus there would be no Stoicism as we know it. The Stoics themselves said it plainly. They had a phrase, a kind of tribute they repeated across generations. If Chrysippus had not existed, neither would the Stoa, neither would the porch, neither would the philosophy, neither would Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca, none of it. One man, holding the entire architecture of a philosophical tradition together with the force of his intellect. Chrysippus was born around 279 BC in Soli, a city in what is now southern Turkey. He came to Athens as a young man and studied under Cleanthes. Yes, the same Cleanthes we talked about earlier, the boxer-turned-water carrier. When Cleanthes died around 230 BC, Chrysippus became the third head of the Stoic school. And then he did something extraordinary. He sat down, and he built. Not a building, not a monument. He built a system, the most comprehensive philosophical system the ancient world had ever seen. He took Zeno's initial insights and Cleanthes' emotional depth, and he organized everything, categorized everything, defended everything against every possible objection. He reportedly never wrote fewer than 500 lines per day. 500, day after day, year after year. Over the course of his lifetime, he produced more than 700 individual works of philosophy. To put that in perspective, that's roughly one new book every 3 weeks, for decades. But it wasn't just volume. Chrysippus was doing something that wouldn't be fully appreciated for another 2,000 years. He was inventing propositional logic. Now, I know propositional logic doesn't sound particularly exciting at 11 o'clock at night, but stay with me here, because this matters more than you might think. Before Chrysippus, logic was Aristotle's domain. Aristotle's logic was brilliant but limited. It dealt with categories and classes. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. That kind of thing. Chrysippus created something different. He worked with propositions, if-then statements. If it is day, then there is light. Either it is day, or it is night. He formalized the logical connectives that we still use, if, or, and not. Why does this matter? Because those logical connectives, if, then, either, or, they are the foundation of every computer program ever written, every algorithm, every piece of software on your phone, every search engine query, every artificial intelligence system. Chrysippus, writing on papyrus scrolls in a philosophical school in Athens in the 3rd century BC, laid the groundwork for the digital age, 2,200 years before the first computer was built. And he did all of this not as an abstract exercise. For Chrysippus, logic was therapeutic. He believed that most human suffering comes from faulty reasoning, from errors in how we process information about the world. If you could fix the logic, you could fix the suffering. Sound familiar? It should. That's essentially what cognitive behavioral therapy does. CBT, the most widely practiced and evidence-based form of talk therapy in the modern world, traces its intellectual lineage directly through Chrysippus's approach to treating what the Stoics called the passions. He called it a therapy of extirpating the unruly passions which depress and crush the soul. 23 centuries later, a therapist might describe CBT as identifying and restructuring cognitive distortions that contribute to emotional distress. Same idea, different vocabulary. Chrysippus got there first. He also developed something called compatibilism, the idea that free will and a deterministic universe can coexist, that even if everything in the cosmos follows a chain of cause and effect, you still have genuine choices within that chain. You're not a puppet, you're a participant. This is an incredibly sophisticated idea. Philosophers are still debating it today, and Chrysippus articulated it over 2 millennia ago. Now, I've been building up this portrait of an intellectual giant, a man of supreme rationality, a man who wrote 700 books defending the power of reason over emotion, which makes his death absolutely perfect. Because here's how Chrysippus died. Nightlings. He was about 73 years old, and one day he saw a donkey eating his figs. Just a donkey, standing there, munching on his figs like it owned the place. And Chrysippus, the man who had built the most rigorous logical system in the ancient world, the man who had written more about emotional control than any philosopher before or since, he turned to a servant and called out, "Now give the donkey a drink of pure wine to wash down the figs." And then he started laughing. And he couldn't stop. He laughed so hard that he died. The greatest systematizer of Stoicism, a philosophy built on rational self-control, died because he found a donkey eating his figs so unbearably funny that his body simply gave out. Now, I should tell you that some scholars think this story was invented by critics of Stoicism, a joke at the expense of the Stoics rather than by a Stoic. And that's possible. But even if it's embellished, there's a lesson buried inside the laughter. Because the lesson is this: even the most disciplined mind is still a human mind. Even the most rigorous philosopher is still a person. And sometimes the universe sends a donkey to eat your figs. And all your logic, and all your systems, and all your 700 books can't stop you from laughing until you cry. And maybe that's the point. Chrysippus built something extraordinary. A system so complete that it held an entire philosophical tradition together for centuries. But he also showed us, in the most human way imaginable, that systems are tools, not prisons. That rationality is a practice, not a personality. That even the architect of Stoic logic is allowed to laugh at a donkey. Build your systems, nightlings. Build them carefully. Build them well, but don't forget to laugh when life sends you something absurd. Because it will. It always does. Let me tell you about a man who looked directly at his own pain and told it to its face that it wasn't real. Not metaphorically, not in a philosophical treatise. He did this while his entire body was screaming with agony. His name was Posidonius. And if you haven't heard of him, most people haven't. You're about to meet someone who might have been the most remarkable mind in the ancient world. Posidonius was born around 135 BC in Apamea, Syria. He was a Stoic philosopher, but he was also everything else: astronomer, geographer, historian, mathematician, teacher, politician, traveller. The word polymath was practically invented for men like Posidonius. He travelled the entire known world. And I don't mean he took a few trips. He journeyed through Greece, Spain, Africa, Italy, Sicily, Dalmatia, Gaul, and beyond the borders of the Roman Empire itself. In an age when most people never left the village they were born in. Posidonius walked the earth. In Gades, modern Cadiz, Spain, he stood on the Atlantic coast and did something no one had done before. He watched the tides, he measured them, and he connected the daily tides to the orbit of the moon and the monthly tides to lunar cycles. In the 2nd century BC, standing at the edge of the known world, this man figured out what drives the tides. He also calculated the circumference of the Earth. His estimate, approximately 24,000 miles. The actual circumference, 24,901 miles, off by less than 4%, using nothing but mathematics and astronomical observation. Here's an incredible footnote to that calculation. Posidonius's number, slightly too small, was accepted for 1,500 years. It was the number that the geographer Ptolemy endorsed. And it was the number that a sailor named Christopher Columbus used in 1492 to estimate the distance from Europe to Asia. Columbus thought Asia was closer than it actually was because of Posidonius's tiny error, which means, in a roundabout way, a Stoic philosopher's mathematical calculation in the 2nd century BC contributed to the European discovery of the Americas. But I haven't told you the story yet, the one that matters. Posidonius settled in Rhodes around 95 BC and established a philosophical school that eventually eclipsed Athens itself as the centre of Stoic thought. His reputation was so extraordinary that the most powerful men in the Roman world travelled to his island to learn from him. Cicero, the greatest orator in Roman history, studied under Posidonius and called him a friend. And then there was Pompey, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, one of the 3 most powerful men in Rome, a military commander who had conquered half the known world. Pompey visited Posidonius twice. The first visit, in 66 BC, included a detail that speaks volumes. When Pompey arrived at Posidonius's door, this general who commanded armies, who had kings bow before him, he ordered his lictors to lower their fasces. The fasces were the bundled rods that symbolized Roman military and political authority. They were carried before every general and magistrate. Lowering them was an act of supreme respect. It meant acknowledging that you were in the presence of someone greater than yourself. Pompey the Great lowered his symbols of power before a philosopher's door. But it was the second visit that created the moment I want you to carry with you tonight. When Pompey returned in 62 BC, Posidonius was in agony. He was suffering from a severe attack of gout, a condition that causes excruciating pain in the joints, often described as feeling like your foot is being crushed in a vice. Every movement is torture. Every heartbeat sends fire through your bones. And yet, when Pompey arrived, Posidonius was lecturing, actively teaching. He was delivering a discourse on the subject of moral good, on what it truly means to live a virtuous life. The pain was visibly agonizing. You could see it in his face, in the way he held his body. And at various points during the lecture, the pain would flare so intensely that even Posidonius, this man of extraordinary discipline, would have to pause. But he didn't stop. Each time the pain surged, each time his body screamed at him to surrender. He would look at his afflicted leg, point at it and say out loud to the pain itself, It is no good, Pain. Bothersome you may be, but you will never persuade me that you are an evil. And then he would continue lecturing, not ignoring the pain, not pretending it didn't exist, addressing it, like an opponent in a debate, like someone who had come to his lecture uninvited and was trying to disrupt the proceedings. You are here, Pain. I acknowledge you. But you do not get to define what is good and what is evil. You are a sensation, a physical event. You are not a moral category. You are not proof that the universe is unjust. You are not evidence that life is suffering. You are just pain, and I will not give you more power than that. Think about what this means for you and me. In our world, right now, tonight, pain has become the ultimate authority. We organize our entire lives around avoiding it. We take pills to numb it. We scroll through our phones to distract from it. We build walls and routines and habits, all designed to keep discomfort as far away as possible. And when pain arrives anyway, as it always does, we treat it like proof that something has gone wrong, that we've failed somehow, that the universe is broken. Posidonius, with gout burning through his joints, with one of the most powerful men in the world watching, stood up and said, no, pain is real, suffering is real, but the meaning. You assign to your pain, that's up to you. Pain is not an evil, it's just a visitor, a bothersome one, an unwelcome one, but just a visitor. His school in Rhodes continued after his death, maintained by his own children. He died around 51 BC at the extraordinary age of approximately 85. His writings, like so many of the ancient Stoics, did not survive in complete form. But they were so comprehensive, so brilliant, that they became what one scholar called a mine of information for every major writer who came after. Cicero, Livy, Plutarch, Strabo. And that single moment, an old man pointing at his swollen, agonized leg and telling pain that it would never convince him it was an evil, that moment has echoed through 21 centuries. So tonight, nightlings, if you're lying there with some ache in your body, some worry in your mind, some fear that won't quite let you rest, try this. Don't fight it. Don't flee from it. Don't pretend it isn't there. Just look at it, directly, the way Posidonius looked at his swollen leg, and say, you are here, I see you, but you will never convince me that you are more powerful than I am. And then close your eyes and let yourself rest, because pain is just a visitor. And visitors eventually leave. Here's something that might surprise you. The man who did more to preserve Stoic philosophy than any other person in history wasn't actually a Stoic. His name was Marcus Tullius Cicero, and he was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary human beings who ever lived. Lawyer, politician, orator, writer, translator. He was elected to every principal office in Rome, quaestor, aedile, praetor consul, at the earliest legal age for each position. That had almost never happened before, and it was especially remarkable because Cicero was a new man. No noble ancestry, no aristocratic connections, just brilliance. But Cicero's greatest contribution wasn't political. It was linguistic. You see, Greek philosophy had been written in Greek, which meant that for the vast majority of the Roman world, which spoke Latin, these ideas were locked behind a language barrier. The concepts existed, the wisdom was there, but most people simply couldn't access it. Cicero changed that. He sat down and translated Greek philosophical concepts into Latin. And when Latin didn't have a word for what the Greeks were saying, he invented one. Let that sink in for a moment. The word morals, Cicero invented it. The word individual, Cicero. Science, Cicero. Property, image, appetite. These are words we use every day. Words so fundamental to how we think and communicate that we assume they've always existed. They haven't. One man sitting at a desk in Rome in the 1st century BC created them. Without Cicero's translations, without his tireless work of rendering Greek thought into Latin, most of what we know about Stoicism, Epicureanism, and academic skepticism would have been lost. Forever, completely. And here's the beautiful irony. Cicero wasn't doing this as a Stoic. He was an academic skeptic, a philosopher who believed in examining every argument from every side before accepting anything. He thought Stoic ethics were the most useful system available, but he wasn't dogmatic about it. He was free to take what was best from every school of thought, which might be the most Stoic thing about him. Now, Cicero's political life was marked by a courage that matched his intellect. He exposed the Catiline conspiracy, a plot to overthrow the Roman Republic, with a series of speeches so powerful that they're still studied in schools today. He stood up to Julius Caesar. He fought for the Republic when powerful men were tearing it apart. And when Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC, Cicero saw a chance to restore what had been lost. He launched a series of devastating speeches against Mark Antony, the Philippics, attacking Antony's tyrannical ambitions with everything he had. It was a brave act. It was also a death sentence. When Antony reconciled with Caesar's adopted son Octavian, they drew up lists of enemies to be killed, prescription lists. Octavian argued for 2 days to keep Cicero off the list. 2 days, but Antony was immovable. Cicero would be the first to die. Cicero tried to flee. He almost made it to the coast, but a slave, a man Cicero had personally educated, had given every advantage to, betrayed his location to the soldiers. When they found him, Cicero ordered his servants to set down the litter he was travelling in. He didn't run. He didn't beg. He sat there, clasped his chin in his left hand, as was his habit, and looked steadily at his killers. Most of the soldiers present covered their faces. They couldn't watch. The executioner struck. It took 3 blows and some sawing to remove his head. The man holding the sword was inexperienced. And then Antony ordered something that made all of Rome shudder. Cicero's head and his hands, the hands that had written the Philippics, were hacked off and nailed to the rostra in the Forum, the very platform from which Cicero had delivered his greatest speeches. The very spot where his words had moved senates and shaped nations. Antony's wife, Fulvia, took Cicero's head into her hands. She pulled out his tongue, the tongue that had spoken so powerfully against her husband, and stabbed it repeatedly with her golden hairpin. It's horrifying. And I tell you this not for the shock of it, though it is shocking, but because of what happened next. The words survived. Fulvia could stab the tongue. Antony could nail the hands to a platform. They could kill the man, but they could not kill the ideas, the translations, the words he had forged from nothing. Here's how the story ends, Nightlings, and this is the part I want you to carry with you. Years later, after Antony was defeated, after Octavian became Augustus and ruled the entire Roman world, the emperor caught his grandson hiding a book. The boy tried to conceal it under his robes. Augustus pulled it out. It was a book by Cicero. The grandson was terrified. After all, Augustus had allowed Cicero's murder. Surely reading the dead man's work was forbidden. But Augustus took the book. He read most of it, standing there. And then he handed it back to the boy and said, "A learned man, my child, a learned man, and a lover of his country." The man who allowed Cicero's death praised his words, because words, the right words put together by someone who cares deeply enough about truth, words like that cannot be killed. Not by soldiers, not by hairpins, not by the most powerful empire on earth. Cicero's son eventually became co-consul, and in that capacity he had the profound satisfaction of announcing Mark Antony's death to the Senate. The tongue that Fulvia had stabbed had the last word after all. So, what's the practice here? What's the 15th principle that modern self-help gets wrong? It's this. The most important thing you can do in your life isn't what you build. It isn't what you achieve. It isn't the empire you construct or the followers you accumulate. The most important thing you can do is preserve what matters, translate it, record it, pass it on. Cicero didn't invent Stoicism. He translated it. He made it accessible. He gave it the words it needed to survive. And because of that, you and I are lying here tonight, 21 centuries later, talking about ideas that might otherwise have vanished into dust. Every teacher who stays late, every parent who reads aloud, every writer who struggles to find exactly the right word, every person who takes something beautiful and says, "This matters too much to be forgotten." You are Cicero, working at your desk, translating the untranslatable, making sure that what deserves to live lives on. That is preservation. That is legacy. That is the 15th Stoic practice. And it might be the most important one of all. We're nearly at the end now, Nightlings, nearly there. And for this last practice, this final piece of ancient wisdom that I want to give you before you drift off, I need to take you further back than we've gone all night, back past Marcus Aurelius and Seneca, past Epictetus and Zeno and Diogenes, back to a man who lived 500 years before Christ, a man who the Stoics considered their greatest intellectual ancestor, a man who spent most of his life weeping. His name was Heraclitus, and he is known to history as the weeping philosopher. Heraclitus was born around 535 BC in Ephesus, one of the great cities of the ancient world. His family was aristocratic. His brother held the title of king, a largely ceremonial role, but a prestigious one. Heraclitus could have had power, position, comfort. He gave it all away. He yielded his royal title to his brother and walked away from everything that his family, his class, and his city expected of him. He turned instead to philosophy, and not the kind of philosophy practiced in academies with eager students and wealthy patrons. Heraclitus's philosophy was solitary, angry, brilliant, incomprehensible. They called him the dark and the obscure, because his writings were so cryptic, so compressed, so layered with meaning that most people couldn't understand them. He wrote like an oracle, in fragments, in riddles, in lightning strikes of insight that illuminated everything for a fraction of a second, and then left you in deeper darkness than before. He had absolute contempt for other philosophers. Not just disagreement, contempt. He believed they were all missing the fundamental nature of reality, and he wasn't shy about saying so. Heraclitus wrote one work, a single book written on papyrus. He carried it to the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and left it there, as a dedication, as an offering, as if to say, "This is the only thing I have worth giving to the gods." That book no longer exists. It survived for centuries. People were still reading it in the 2nd century AD, but eventually, like so much of the ancient world, it was lost. What remains are fragments. Over 100 of them preserved because other writers quoted him. And among those fragments is a sentence that changed everything. Pantarei. Everything flows. You cannot step into the same river twice. The water that touched your foot a moment ago has already moved downstream. New water rushes to take its place. The river you step into is never the river you stepped into before. And you are not the person who stepped in last time either. Everything flows, everything changes, nothing remains. This sounds simple. It is anything but. Because what Heraclitus was saying 25 centuries ago in a temple in Asia Minor is something that modern psychology, physics, and neuroscience are only now beginning to fully appreciate. The self is not a fixed thing. The world is not a fixed thing. Reality itself is a process, not a state. You're not the same person you were yesterday. Literally. Your cells are different. Your neural connections have shifted. Your memories have been subtly rewritten by the act of remembering them. The person who fell asleep last night is not quite the person who woke up this morning. And tomorrow, you will be different again. For most people, this is terrifying. We cling to permanence. We want to believe that our identities are solid, that our relationships are stable, that the ground beneath our feet will always be there. Change is the thing we fear most. Losing a job, losing a partner, losing our health, losing ourselves. But Heraclitus looked at all of that and said, "You're fighting the wrong battle. Change isn't the enemy. Change is the nature of reality. Fighting change is like fighting gravity. You can do it for a while with enormous effort, but eventually you will lose, and all you'll have gained is exhaustion." The Stoics heard this, and they built their entire worldview around it. When Zeno taught that we should live according to nature, he was echoing Heraclitus. When Marcus Aurelius wrote about impermanence and the cosmic perspective in his Meditations, he was building on foundations that Heraclitus laid 5 centuries earlier. Marcus even quoted Heraclitus directly. The flowing river, the ever-changing fire. Because Heraclitus also gave the Stoics their most powerful concept, the Logos. The Logos is the rational principle that governs the universe. It is the order within the chaos, the pattern within the flux. Everything changes, yes, but it changes according to a deeper logic. The river flows, but it flows somewhere. The fire burns, but it burns with purpose. This concept, the Logos, became the absolute center of Stoic philosophy. It was their term for divine reason, for the rational structure of the cosmos, for the thread of meaning that runs through all existence. And it didn't stop with the Stoics. The concept traveled through centuries, through cultures, through languages, until it appeared in one of the most famous opening lines ever written, the Gospel of John. "In the beginning was the Logos. In the beginning was the Word, the rational principle, the order within the chaos. All of it traces back to a weeping philosopher in Ephesus who gave up a crown." Now, there's a lesson in Heraclitus's life that goes beyond philosophy. It's about acceptance, not passive acceptance, not lying down and letting the world wash over you. active acceptance, conscious acceptance. The kind of acceptance that says, I know things will change, I know that what I love will transform, I know that the person I am tonight will not be the person I am tomorrow. And I am at peace with that, because the river doesn't stop being beautiful just because it flows. In fact, it's beautiful because it flows. A river that stops flowing is just a pond, and eventually a swamp, and eventually nothing. It is movement, it is change, it is flow that makes a river what it is. And the same is true of you. Every worry that's keeping you awake tonight, it will pass. Every fear, every regret, every anxious thought circling your mind like a hawk, it will change, it will transform into something else, something you can't predict and can't control. And that is not a threat, nightlings. That is a promise. Everything flows. The pain flows away. The grief flows into understanding. The fear flows into courage. The darkness flows into dawn. Heraclitus wept because he understood this more deeply than anyone. He saw the beauty of impermanence, and it overwhelmed him. Not with sadness exactly, but with a kind of aching awareness that every moment is the last of its kind, that every sunset is unique, that every conversation, every meal, every embrace exists once, and then flows into memory. There is grief in that, and there is glory. Let yourself feel both tonight. And now, nightlings, I want to bring us back to where we began, back to a tent on the edge of the Roman Empire. Back to a man who ruled the known world, but spent most of his life far from comfort, far from luxury, far from home. Back to Marcus Aurelius. We started this evening with his inner citadel, the fortress he built inside his own mind to withstand plague and war and the impossible demands of being emperor. But Marcus had another practice, a quieter one, a practice he performed not on the battlefield, not in the Senate chamber, not in the face of crisis. He performed it at night, every night, in those last minutes before sleep. He called it his evening review, and I've saved it for last because you're doing it right now. Lying there, in the dark, between the day that's ending and the sleep that hasn't quite arrived. This is the exact moment Marcus Aurelius was talking about. This is the space he made sacred. Here's what he did. Every evening, after the meetings, after the audiences with generals and senators, after the edicts and the judicial decisions and the endless grinding machinery of running a vast empire, Marcus Aurelius would retire to his quarters. He'd sit or lie down, and he would review his day. Not like a productivity guru reviewing his task list. Not like a self-help coach asking, did I achieve my goals? Nothing so mechanical as that. Marcus reviewed his day like a philosopher. He asked himself questions, hard questions, the kind of questions most of us spend our entire lives avoiding. Did I act with wisdom today? Or was there a moment when I let anger take the wheel? Was there a conversation where I spoke too quickly, judged too harshly, dismissed someone I should have listened to? Did I practice courage? Not the battlefield kind. He got plenty of that during the day, but the quieter kind. The courage to admit I was wrong. The courage to change my mind. The courage to sit with discomfort instead of reaching for distraction. Did I show kindness? Not the performative kind that seeks recognition, but the genuine kind that no one sees. Was I patient with the servant who brought me food? Was I generous with the soldier who asked for leave? Did I treat every person I encountered today as a fellow member of the human community, or did I let my title create distance between us? And perhaps the hardest question of all, did I waste today? Did I spend my finite hours on things that truly mattered? Or did I fritter them away on trivial concerns, political games, and petty disputes that will be forgotten before the next sunrise? Marcus wrote about this in his Meditations, not as instruction to others. Remember, the Meditations were never meant to be published. They were his private journal, his midnight conversations with himself. And in those conversations, he was ruthless. He didn't spare himself. He didn't make excuses. He didn't rationalize his failures as learning experiences or growth opportunities. He looked at his day with clear eyes and said, "Here is where I fell short. Here is where I let the noise of the world drown out the voice of wisdom. Here is where I forgot who I am." And then, and this is the part most people miss, he let it go. He didn't spiral into guilt. He didn't flagellate himself. He didn't lie awake rehearsing his failures. He acknowledged them. He committed to doing better tomorrow. And he slept. That's the practice. Review, acknowledge, release, sleep. It sounds almost ridiculously simple. And yet, when was the last time you did it? When was the last time you lay in bed and actually, deliberately, consciously reviewed your day? Not the anxious mental replay that happens automatically, the one where you cringe at something you said in a meeting, or worry about an email you forgot to send. Not that. That's not review. That's rumination. That's your brain chewing on itself. The evening review is different. It has structure, it has purpose, and most importantly, it has an ending. You review, you acknowledge, you release, you sleep. The Pythagoreans practiced something similar before Marcus Aurelius. They called it the 3 questions, and they did it every night. Seneca also describes the practice in his essay on anger. He wrote, "When the light has been removed and my wife has fallen silent, I pass the whole day before my eyes and examine my own words and deeds. I conceal nothing from myself. I overlook nothing. For why should I fear any consequence from my errors when I can say, 'See that you don't do that any more. I forgive you this time. See that you don't do that any more. I forgive you this time.' There's something almost unbearably tender in that." Here is one of the most powerful men in Rome, lying in bed next to his sleeping wife, reviewing his day and forgiving himself, not with cheap absolution, not with "it's fine, everything's fine," but with the compassionate firmness of a teacher who loves his student. "See that you don't do that any more. I forgive you this time." How different would your nights be if you spoke to yourself that way? Most of us bring a prosecutor to bed, not a teacher. We rehearse our failures with the mercilessness of a hanging judge. We find ourselves guilty on all counts and then wonder why we can't sleep. The verdict has been delivered. The sentence is anxiety. And we serve it every night, alone in the dark. The Stoic Evening Review says, "Stop. You are not on trial. You are in school. The day was a lesson. Some of it you got right. Some of it you got wrong. Acknowledge both. And then class is dismissed. Sleep is the bell. Tomorrow is a new semester. Now, there's modern science behind this, and it's worth knowing about because it confirms what Marcus Aurelius discovered 1800 years ago. Researchers at Baylor University School of Medicine conducted a study where they asked one group of participants to write about tasks they'd completed that day. and another group to write a to-do list for the tasks they needed to accomplish tomorrow. The result: the group that wrote about tomorrow, the group that effectively conducted a forward-looking review, fell asleep 9 minutes faster than the control group. 9 minutes might not sound like much, but if you've ever spent 45 minutes staring at the ceiling, 9 minutes is an eternity. The reason is what psychologists call the Zeigarnik effect, the mind's tendency to fixate on incomplete tasks. Your brain treats unfinished business like an open browser tab. It keeps running in the background, consuming energy, generating anxiety, preventing the system from shutting down. The evening review closes the tabs. When you deliberately review your day, what happened, what went well, what didn't, and what you want to do tomorrow, you're telling your brain, "We've processed this. It's handled. You can let go now." Marcus Aurelius didn't know about the Zeigarnik effect. He didn't have fMRI scans or sleep studies. He had something better. He had thousands of nights of personal experimentation. He had the raw data of his own experience, tested and refined over decades. In conditions more stressful than any laboratory could simulate. An emperor, at war, during a plague, losing children, losing friends, watching his empire slowly crumble at the edges. And every night, he sat down, reviewed, forgave, and slept. There's something else about this practice that I want you to notice. It's the opposite of modern morning routines. Modern self-help is obsessed with mornings. Wake up at 5, journal, meditate, exercise, cold shower, bulletproof coffee, optimize the first hour of your day, and the rest will follow. That's the promise. And it's not wrong exactly. But it misses something crucial. How you end your day determines how you begin the next one. If you go to sleep with unresolved anger, you wake up irritable. If you go to sleep with unprocessed anxiety, you wake up in dread. If you go to sleep without acknowledging what you did well, you wake up feeling inadequate. Marcus Aurelius understood that the evening is the hinge of the whole cycle. Get the evening right, review well, release well, sleep well, and the morning takes care of itself. He didn't need a morning routine. He had an evening one. And so tonight, nightlings, let me walk you through it. Not as instruction, as invitation. You can do this in 30 seconds or 30 minutes. There's no wrong length. First, what happened today? Not every detail, just the shape of the day. The meetings, the conversations, the tasks, the interactions. Let them pass through your mind like scenes from a film. Don't judge yet, just observe. Second, where did you fall short? And I mean honestly fall short. Not the manufactured guilt that anxiety loves to generate, but the real moments where you could have done better. Maybe you snapped at someone who didn't deserve it. Maybe you procrastinated on something important. Maybe you let fear stop you from doing something you know you should have done. Whatever it is, acknowledge it. And then here's the Marcus Aurelius part. Say to yourself, see that you don't do that anymore. I forgive you this time. Third, where did you do well? This is the part most people skip, and it's the part that matters most for sleep. Because your brain, left to its own devices, will focus exclusively on the negative. That's how it's wired. The negativity bias. The survival mechanism that kept your ancestors alive by making them hypervigilant about threats. But you're not being chased by a predator. You're lying in bed, and you need to acknowledge the good. The kind word you said. The hard task you completed. The patience you showed. The small act of courage no one else noticed. Let yourself feel that. Not pride, not smugness. Just recognition. You did something right today. Let that be the last thing you hold in your mind. Fourth, tomorrow. Not a to-do list, just a direction. One thing you want to practice tomorrow. One principle you want to carry forward. One area where today's lesson becomes tomorrow's intention. And then you're done. That's it. The tabs are closed, the day has been processed, the lesson has been learned. And the teacher, the gentle, firm, compassionate teacher that Seneca described, has said, I forgive you this time. Marcus Aurelius did this in a tent, on the frozen banks of the Danube, with Germanic warriors camped on the opposite shore. He did it during the Antonine Plague, when 2,000 Romans were dying every day. He did it after burying most of his children. The majority of his 14 children died before he did. He did it when his empire was crumbling, his body was failing, and every reason to despair was stacked against every reason to hope. And he still found things to be grateful for. He still found moments of wisdom in the wreckage of his days. He still forgave himself, and he still slept. If Marcus Aurelius, carrying the weight of the entire Roman Empire on his shoulders, could end his day with grace, then surely, nightlings, surely you can too. So let's do it together, right now. Think of your day. Let it come. Let it pass. The good parts and the hard parts. All of it. Now, acknowledge where you fell short, see it clearly, and say, I forgive you this time. Now, remember what you did well. Even the small things, especially the small things. And now, let it all go. The day is done. It flowed past you like Heraclitus's river. It will never come again. And that's not sad. That's just the nature of things. Tomorrow, you'll step into a new river, and you'll bring everything you learned tonight with you. But for now, rest. There was a Roman senator, a Stoic philosopher, whose name you have almost certainly never heard. And yet his way of making decisions was so elegant, so practical, so immediately useful, that once you learn it, you'll never forget it. His name was Peconius Agrippinus. And the first thing you need to know about him is that he was a man who refused, absolutely refused, to blend in. Agrippinus lived during the reign of Nero, which meant he lived during one of the most dangerous periods in Roman history. Nero was paranoid, volatile, and increasingly murderous. Senators who opposed him disappeared. Philosophers who challenged him were exiled or killed. The smart play, the safe play, was to keep your head down. Say the right things, vote the right way. Don't make waves. Agrippinus made waves. He was known for his unwavering commitment to his own principles, even when those principles put him in direct conflict with imperial power. Epictetus, who admired Agrippinus greatly, recorded several stories about him in the Discourses. And the most famous of those stories involves a metaphor so simple, so vivid, that it survived for nearly 2,000 years. The purple thread. Here's what Agrippinus said. Imagine a white toga, a plain, ordinary, white woolen toga, the garment every Roman citizen wore, the kind of toga that blends into a crowd. Now imagine that in the weaving of this toga, there is one thread that is different. One thread that is not white, but purple. The imperial purple. The thread that catches your eye. The thread that makes the toga distinctive. You want me to be like the rest of the threads, Agrippinus said. The white ones, the ordinary ones, the ones that disappear into the fabric. But what would the toga be without the purple thread? Just white cloth, unremarkable, indistinguishable from every other piece of fabric in Rome. I choose to be the purple thread, not out of arrogance, not out of a desire for attention, but because he understood something profound about human nature and about the purpose of a life well lived. The world doesn't need another person who conforms. The world needs people who are willing to be different, to think differently, to live differently, to stand apart from the crowd, not to be seen but to be true. And Agrippinus didn't just say this, he lived it every single day, with a consistency that bordered on the superhuman. Epictetus tells us about the morning when Agrippinus received word that he was being tried before the Roman Senate. Now let me put this in context. Being tried before the Senate under Nero was a potentially fatal event. Senators were convicted and executed. Properties were seized. Entire families were destroyed. This wasn't a parking ticket. This was a life-or-death legal proceeding. And Agrippinus said it was time for exercise. "Let us go and take our morning exercise," he told his companions. And they did. They went to the gymnasium. They exercised, they bathed. They went about their morning exactly as they would on any other day. When a messenger arrived with the verdict, guilty, exile, Agrippinus asked one question. "And my property, is it confiscated?" "No, it is not." "Well then," said Agrippinus, "let us go to Arria and dine there." Arria was a town just outside Rome, a nice place for dinner. And Agrippinus, having just been convicted by the Roman Senate, having just been sentenced to exile from the city he'd lived in his entire life, treated it as though someone had told him the weather had changed. An inconvenience, not a catastrophe. Now, before you think this is just bravado, just a man performing calmness for an audience, understand what's happening beneath the surface. Agrippinus had already done the work. He had already practiced the evening review. He had already wrestled with the dichotomy of control. He had already built his inner citadel. The trial, the verdict, the exile, these were all in the category of things not up to us. He had prepared for this. Not this specific event, but this type of event. The type where the external world delivers a blow that you cannot prevent. And because he had prepared, because the philosophy wasn't a theory but a practice, he was free. Free to exercise, free to bathe, free to dine, free to live his life on his own terms, regardless of what the Senate or the Emperor or the entire machinery of Rome decided to do with him. But the deepest lesson from Agrippinus isn't the trial, it's the purple thread. Because the purple thread is really about a question. The most important question a human being can ask themselves. Not what should I do, but who am I? Agrippinus made every decision by asking, is this consistent with who I am? Not is this convenient, not is this popular, not will this advance my career, but is this what the purple thread would do? When other senators were flattering Nero, Agrippinus asked, is flattery consistent with who I am? The answer was no. So he didn't flatter. When other senators were voting against their conscience to avoid punishment, Agrippinus asked, is cowardice consistent with who I am? The answer was no, so he voted his conscience. When exile arrived, as it inevitably would for a man who refused to bend, Agrippinus asked, is despair consistent with who I am? The answer was no. So he went to dinner. This is a fundamentally different approach to ethics than what most self-help teaches. Modern self-help is obsessed with goals. Set goals, achieve goals, optimize for goals. Everything is measured against an external target. Agrippinus said, "Forget goals. Ask instead, who am I? What kind of person do I want to be?" And then make every decision, every single one from the trivial to the monumental, by asking whether the action is consistent with that person. If you decide you are the kind of person who tells the truth, then telling the truth isn't a goal you achieve. It's an identity you inhabit. You don't have to motivate yourself to be honest. You just are honest. Because that's who you are. Because you are the purple thread. If you decide you are the kind of person who shows up for the people you love, then showing up isn't on your to-do list. It's not a commitment you have to remind yourself about. It's just what you do. It's what the purple thread does. And here's the beautiful thing about this practice. It simplifies everything. When a difficult choice arrives, and difficult choices always arrive, you don't need to agonize over pros and cons. You don't need a decision matrix or a flowchart. You just need to ask one question. Is this what the purple thread would do? The answer is usually immediate, usually clear, usually undeniable. And then you just do it, even if it costs you, even if it leads to exile, even if the entire Senate votes against you, because you'd rather be the purple thread in exile than a white thread on the emperor's couch. So tonight, nightlings, and this is a question worth falling asleep with. What is your purple thread? What is the quality, the principle, the commitment that makes you, you? Not the version of you that conforms. Not the version that keeps its head down and says the right things. The real you. The distinctive one. The one that, if removed from the fabric of your life, would leave nothing but unremarkable white cloth. Find that thread. Hold it. And tomorrow, weave it into everything you do. And so, nightlings, here we are. 18 practices, 18 stories, lives lived across 25 centuries, and every single one of them whispering the same truth into the darkness. You already have what you need. Marcus Aurelius showed us how to build a fortress inside our own minds, a place no plague, no war, no betrayal can touch. Zeno taught us that the worst moment of our lives might be the beginning of everything. Epictetus proved that a broken body cannot break an unbreakable will. Stilpo stood in the ashes of his burning city and said, "I carry all my goods within me." Cato walked barefoot through the desert and said, "Comfort is a choice I decline." Musonius Rufus found fresh water on a waterless island and said, "Resourceful people are resourceful no matter where they find themselves." Cleanthes started philosophy at 50, writing on oyster shells because he couldn't afford paper. Helvidius Priscus walked into an emperor's court and told the truth, knowing it would cost him his life. Arria held up a blade and said 3 words that echoed across centuries. It does not hurt. Cato the Younger chose death over submission. Seneca turned his own forced execution into a final lesson on how to live. Diogenes told the most powerful man on earth to step out of his light. Chrysippus built an architecture of thought so vast it held an entire civilization together, and then died laughing at a donkey. Posidonius looked his own agony in the eye and told it, "You are not an evil." Cicero forged new words from nothing so that wisdom could survive the death of empires. Heraclitus, the weeping philosopher, showed us that everything flows, everything changes, and the only constant in the universe is transformation itself. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor who began our journey tonight, showed us one last thing, that the most important moment of the day isn't the morning, it's the evening, the moment of review, the moment of release, the moment you're in right now. And Agrippinus, the man who dined calmly after his own conviction, showed us that the most powerful question we can ask isn't what should I do, but who am I? 18 people, 18 practices, one message. You don't need another app. You don't need another productivity system. You don't need to optimize your morning routine or track your sleep score or follow a 12-step program designed by someone who's never suffered a day in their life. What you need has been waiting for you for 2,000 years. Written on papyrus scrolls and oyster shells. Spoken in prison cells and emperors' palaces. Whispered by slaves and shouted by kings. Carried across deserts and preserved through plagues. It's already yours. The Stoics knew something that modern self-help has forgotten. That wisdom isn't something you acquire. It's something you practice. Day after day, night after night. In the small moments, in the quiet moments, in moments exactly like this one. So here's what I'd like you to do. Pick one, just one, from everything you've heard tonight. Maybe it's Marcus Aurelius's Inner Citadel. Maybe it's Epictetus's Dichotomy of Control. Maybe it's Diogenes' Radical Freedom, or Heraclitus's Flowing River. Maybe it's the evening review you just practiced. Right here, right now, in these final quiet moments before sleep. Whatever spoke to you, whatever made you pause, whatever felt like it was written specifically for this moment in your life, pick that one. And tomorrow, practice it. Not perfectly, just practice it. For 5 minutes, in one situation, with one thought. And then the next day, practice it again. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. Not through grand transformations or sudden enlightenments, but through the slow, steady daily practice of choosing wisdom over impulse, reason over fear, acceptance over resistance. 2,000 years from now, no one will remember your morning routine, but the way you treated people, the strength you showed when everything was falling apart, the grace with which you accepted what you couldn't change, that endures. The Stoics proved it. Their buildings are rubble. Their empires are dust. Their scrolls have crumbled to nothing. But their ideas are still here. Since you made it this far, I'm glad you enjoyed the episode. If you enjoy these stories, experiencing the lives of others through the millennia, you will definitely enjoy our new channel, The Sleepy Biographer. The same voice, the same epic storytelling, but with a new twist. Sleep now, nightlings. And wake up, as always, a little stronger and a little wiser. The story is done, but yours continues. Good night.